The air at Greenview International Airport thrummed with the restless energy of travelers, hundreds of voices blending into a low hum, punctuated by the squeak of suitcase wheels dragging across the polished tile floor. Overhead, fluorescent lights cast a harsh, sterile glow, illuminating the sprawling lines of people clutching boarding passes and shifting their weight from foot to foot. Naomi Williams, a 35-year-old woman with a quiet strength etched into her features, stood among them. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, her worn handbag gripped tightly in her hands, its leather edges frayed from years of use. Her dark eyes stayed low, tracing the scuffs on the floor as she inched closer to the security checkpoint, her mind drifting to the flight ahead and aware that her day was about to unravel into a nightmare. A sharp voice sliced through the ambient noise like a jagged blade. "Hey, you!" Naomi's head snapped up, her heart jolting as her gaze met the cold, piercing stare of Jack Hayes, a TSA officer in his early 40s. His uniform hung on his broad frame with an air of authority, but it was the smug twist of his lips that sent a shiver down her spine. He strode toward her with purpose, his boots thudding against the tile, his presence radiating a quiet menace. "Step aside," he barked, gesturing with a flick of his wrist. "Your bag needs additional screening." His tone was clipped, icy, but his eyes lingered on her too long, to deliberate, tracing her form in a way that made her skin crawl. "We've got a report. Possible contraband." Naomi's brow creased, confusion warring with a flicker of dread in her chest. "A report," she said, her voice steady but laced with unease. "That's impossible. I haven't done anything wrong." She clutched her bag tighter, her fingers digging into the leather as if it could anchor her against the storm she sensed brewing. Jack's smirk widened, a predator sizing up its prey. "Just follow procedure, lady, over here." He jerked his head toward a small table off to the side, his tone dripping with disdain. Reluctantly, Naomi stepped out of line, her pulse quickening as the eyes of strangers followed her, some curious, others indifferent. Jack wasted no time. He snatched her bag from her grasp and dumped it onto the counter with a carelessness that made her flinch. His thick fingers rummaged through her belongings, pulling out a worn paperback novel and letting it tumble to the floor with a dull thud. "Careful with my things," Naomi protested, her voice rising as she bent to retrieve the book, its pages splaying open on the cold tile. Jack's head whipped toward her, his eyes narrowing. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he snapped, his words sharp enough to cut. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against her ear as he lowered his voice to a menacing whisper. "If you're innocent, you won't mind a little extra inspection." Before Naomi could respond, his hands moved not to the bag, but to her. His fingers brushed against her waist, then slid upward under the pretense of a pat-down, lingering in places they had no right to be. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as shock rooted her to the spot. Then, instinct kicked in. She recoiled, shoving his hands away with a force that surprised even herself. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice trembling with outrage. "You have no right to touch me like that." The words echoed through the checkpoint, drawing the attention of a small crowd that began to form, their murmurs buzzing like flies around a carcass. Jack's expression darkened, his smugness giving way to something uglier. He stepped closer, looming over her, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that swallowed her slight frame. "Don't resist, or I'll make this worse for you," he growled, his voice low and threatening. Naomi's hands shook, but she squared her shoulders, her anger surging past her fear. "This is harassment," she said, her tone sharp and unwavering. "I'll call the police if you don't stop right now." Jack sneered, a flash of cruelty glinting in his eyes. In an instant, he seized her arm, twisting it behind her back with a vicious yank. Pain shot through her shoulder, and she stumbled, a sharp cry escaping her lips. "Let go of me," she shouted, thrashing against his hold, her voice raw with desperation. The crowd thickened, their faces a blur of curiosity and judgment. "What's her problem?" a man muttered, his arms crossed as he watched from a safe distance. "Probably hiding something," a woman replied, her voice dripping with disdain. Jack tightened his grip, his fingers digging into her skin as he yanked her hair, forcing her head back. "Stay still," he barked, loud enough to silence the murmurs for a fleeting moment. Naomi twisted against him, her body trembling with a mix of fury and pain. "You're hurting me," she cried, her voice breaking but fierce. "I've done nothing wrong." Laughter rippled through the onlooker school, mocking. A woman in a bright red coat whispered loudly, "Look at her, causing a scene. Must be guilty of something." A man nearby snickered, his voice carrying over the din. "Riffraff like her shouldn't even be allowed to travel. Bet she's carrying drugs for some gang." The words stung like a slap, but Naomi refused to crumble. With a sudden burst of strength, she wrenched her arm free and shoved Jack hard in the chest. He stumbled back, his face contorting with rage. "You're under arrest for obstruction," he snarled, lunging forward and slamming her to the ground. Her knees crashed against the tile, the impact sending a jolt of agony through her legs. Jack pinned her down, his hand pressing into her back as he reached for his radio with the other. "Backup needed at security checkpoint," he barked into the device, his voice thick with triumph. Naomi struggled beneath him, her breaths ragged as she fought to speak. "You'll regret this," she gasped, her words cutting through the jeers and laughter. "My husband will hear about this. He's the director of this airport." Jack let out a mocking laugh, his weight still bearing down on her. "Oh, sure, and I'm the president. Keep dreaming, lady." The crowd gasped at her claim, but their skepticism hung heavy in the air. "She's bluffing." Someone scoffed. "No way someone like her is married to the airport director," another added, their voice laced with contempt. Naomi gritted her teeth, her resolve hardening as the humiliation burned in her chest. "Marcus Williams is my husband," she declared, her voice rising above the noise. "You'll see soon enough." For a split second, Jack's smirk faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but he quickly masked it with bravado. "Whatever you say. Now stay down, or I'll charge you with resisting arrest." Fumbling with trembling hands, Naomi reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She pressed the call button, her voice shaking but firm as it connected. "Marcus, I'm at security. I need you here now." Jack rolled his eyes, releasing her with a scoff as he stood. "Let's see what fairy tale prince shows up," he muttered, crossing his arms with a smirk. Naomi pushed herself to her feet, her face flushed with a mix of anger and shame. She brushed off her clothes, her hands trembling as she met Jack's gaze with an icy stare. "You'll regret what you just did," she said, her voice low and cutting. Jack chuckled, unfazed. "We'll see about that." The tension hung thick in the air, a palpable weight pressing down on the checkpoint as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Then, the sound of rapid footsteps cut through the chaos, sharp and purposeful. Marcus Williams emerged from the sea of travelers, a towering figure in a tailored suit, his presence radiating authority. His sharp eyes swept over the Senna Naomi, disheveled and defiant, her blouse torn at the sleeve. Jack, smirking with his arms crossed, the onlookers, their amusement poorly concealed. "What the hell is going on here?" Marcus demanded, his voice slicing through the chatter like a whip. Jack straightened, his arrogance unshaken. "Who are you?" he shot back, his tone defiant. Marcus stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "I'm Marcus Williams, director of this airport, and that woman you just assaulted is my wife." The words landed like a thunderclap, drawing shocked gasps from the crowd. Jack's smirk wavered, a flicker of unease creeping into his expression. "Look, Mr. Williams," he stammered, "your wife was behaving suspiciously. I had every right to." "You had no right to touch her," Marcus interrupted, his voice cold and unyielding. He closed the distance between them, his presence towering over Jack. "I want your badge on my desk within the hour. You're done here." Jack stiffened, his face darkening with defiance. "Now hold on, I was just doing my job." "Your job doesn't include harassment or violence," Marcus snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Apologize to her." "Now." Jack hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. Finally, he muttered a grudging, "I'm sorry," his voice barely audible. Naomi didn't flinch, her glare cutting through him like a blade. "That's not an apology," she said, her words dripping with contempt. "You think this ends with a few mumbled words?" Before Jack could respond, another voice broke through the tension. "What's going on here?" All heads turned as Emily Harper, the airport's deputy director, strode into the fray. Her impeccable suit and sharp features gave her an air of detached authority, her expression unreadable. "Emily," Marcus said, turning to her with barely contained fury, "your security team is out of control. Jack Hayes just assaulted my wife." Emily raised an eyebrow, glancing at Jack, who shifted into a defensive stance. "Is that so?" she said calmly, her voice smooth as glass. "Because I was informed there's a bigger issue at hand." Marcus's frown deepened, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "What issue?" Emily gestured toward Naomi with a subtle nod. "We received a tip that your wife might be transporting illegal substances. Standard procedure requires a thorough inspection." Marcus's jaw tightened, disbelief flashing across his face. "That's absurd," he said, his voice edged with anger. Emily's expression remained neutral, unruffled. "Perhaps, but let's confirm, shall we?" "Open her luggage." Naomi stepped forward, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "No. I packed that bag myself. There's nothing in there." Emily ignored her, nodding to Jack. He moved to the suitcase with deliberate slowness, unzipping it as if savoring the moment. The crowd leaned in, the air thick with anticipation. Marcus glared at Emily, his patience fraying. "This is a waste of time, and you know it." Emily's lips twitched faintly. "If she's innocent, there's nothing to worry about." Jack rummaged through the bag, his movements theatrical, until he Powsett held up a small plastic bag filled with white powder. Well, he said, his smirk returning in full force. "Looks like someone has some explaining to do." Naomi's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "That's not mine," she shouted, her voice cracking with panic. "I don't even know what that is." The crowd erupted into whispers, their judgment palpable. Marcus turned to Emily, his voice low and dangerous. "This is ridiculous. That was planted." "Planted?" Emily echoed, her tone feigning surprise. "By whom?" Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Your staff." "My staff? You tell me." Jack stepped forward, holding the bag higher. "We have protocols for this. She's coming with us for questioning." Marcus moved to block him, his stance unyielding. "You're not taking her anywhere," Emily interjected, her voice calm but firm. "Marcus, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're following procedure." Naomi tried to back away, but Jack grabbed her arm again, his grip rough and unrelenting. "Don't touch her," Marcus barked, stepping forward to intervene. Jack shoved Naomi against the wall with a force that made her wince, her shoulders slamming into the hard surface. The crowd gasped, some stepping back, others craning their necks for a better view. In that moment, the scene laid bare the raw truth of power abuse, a stark lesson in justice denied, and the consequences that ripple outward when those entrusted with authority wield it as a weapon. For Naomi, Marcus, and even the onlookers, the battle was far from over, its echoes destined to reshape their understanding of right and wrong in a world too often tilted against the vulnerable. The air in the bustling airport terminal vibrated with tension, thick and suffocating, as Jack's gruff voice sliced through it like a jagged blade. "Resist me again," he barked, his tone dripping with menace, even though Naomi stood motionless, her body rigid with disbelief. Her wrists ached under his iron grip, the cold bite of his fingers pressing into her skin as she fought to keep her composure. She wasn't resisting not physical limit inside. Her mind churned with a storm of fear, anger, and confusion. How had it come to this? One moment, she'd been navigating the familiar chaos of Greenview International Airport, her husband's domain. The next, she was a pawn in a scene she couldn't comprehend. Marcus's voice erupted nearby, a thunderclap of fury reverberating off the polished floors and glass walls. "Get your hands off her," he roared, lunging toward Jack with a desperation that twisted his features into something raw and unrecognizable. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a frantic plea to stop this nightmare before it spiraled further. But before he could reach them, another security officer, a hulking figure with a stony face, stepped into his path, arms outstretched like a barricade. Marcus's momentum faltered, his breath catching as he glared into the man's impassive eyes. "This is out of line," he bellowed, his words echoing through the terminal, drawing the attention of startled travelers who paused with their luggage, whispering and pointing. Emily stood a few feet away, her posture cool and deliberate. arms folded tightly across her chest as if shielding herself from the chaos she'd orchestrated. Her sharp eyes flicked between Marcus and Naomi, calculating every move. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady but edged with a faint condescension, "we have to maintain the integrity of this investigation. You're too close to step back and let the team handle it." Her words were a dagger, twisting deeper with every syllable, and Marcus felt the sting of betrayal. He'd trusted her once, relied on her as his deputy, but now her calm demeanor felt like a mask hiding something sinister. Naomi's struggle intensified as Jack tightened his hold, dragging her toward a secure area at the far end of the terminal. Her sneakers squeaked against the tile floor, her voice trembling but defiant as she protested. "I didn't do anything. This is a setup, you swear it." Her eyes darted wildly, searching for Marcus, for anyone who might see the truth in her pleas. Inside, her chest tightened with a mix of humiliation and dread. She'd never felt so powerless, so stripped of dignity. Jack ignored her, his face a blank slate of indifference, his grip unrelenting as he hauled her past gawking onlookers. Marcus's fists clenched until his knuckles whitened, his mind racing like a runaway train. He wanted to tear Jack apart, to rip Naomi from this nightmare. But every move he made was blocked by the security officer, by Emily's cold authority, by the system he'd spent years upholding. As Naomi disappeared behind a set of double doors, her shouts fading into an eerie silence, Emily turned to him. A faint smile tugged at her lips, so subtle it might have been missed, but it sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "This isn't personal, Marcus," she said, her tone almost as smooth, too practiced. "It's just business." Her words hung in the air, a mockery of everything he stood for. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a vow. "You won't get away with this." His eyes burned into hers, a promise of retribution simmering beneath his rage. Emily's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her amusement, perhaps, or the thrill of a challenge accepted. For her, Naomi's detention was just the opening act in a grander play, a calculated move to discredit Marcus, to topple him from his perch as airport director and claim the power she'd long coveted. Marcus felt it in his bones. This wasn't about justice, it was about ambition, and he'd be damned if he let her win. The story exploded across the media with the ferocity of a wildfire tearing through dry brush. By the next morning, every major news outlet blared headlines about the dramatic airport incident. Marcus Williams, wife detained in drug bust at Greenview. Cameras swarmed the terminal, capturing every angle of the unfolding scandal. Emily Harper seized the moment, stepping into the spotlight with the confidence of a seasoned performer. In the airport's main atrium, surrounded by a restless sea of reporters, she stood at a podium, her tailored suit pristine, her expression a perfect blend of solemnity and resolve. "It is with deep regret," she began, her voice ringing out clear and deliberate, "that I must address a troubling pattern at Greenview International. Under the current leadership, this airport has become a breeding ground for drug trafficking, particularly among certain groups." She paused, letting the insinuation sink in, her eyes scanning the crowd as murmurs rippled through the room. The reporters leaned forward, pens poised, hungry for more. "Just yesterday," she continued, "we made a high-profile arrest, wife of our own airport director, Marcus Williams. This raises serious questions about the integrity of our operations." A shout cut through the buzz. "Are you suggesting Marcus is complicit in drug smuggling?" Emily's lips curved into that faint, enigmatic smile again. "I'm not accusing anyone directly," she said, her tone measured but dripping with implication. "But under his tenure, incidents like this have surged. We have to ask ourselves, is the leadership at Greenview enabling this behavior?" The room erupted, reporters clamoring for details, and Emily fed them just enough vague hints, carefully chosen words to fan the flames without committing to outright lies. By the time she stepped away from the podium, the damage was done. Doubt had taken root, and Marcus's reputation hung by a thread. Meanwhile, Naomi sat in a stark, frigid interrogation room at the local police precinct, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry insects. Her wrists throbbed where the handcuffs had bitten into her skin, and her stomach churned with a nauseating mix of exhaustion and fury. Across the scratched metal table sat two officers, their faces unreadable but their posture rigid with authority. The first, a weary man with a pinched mouth, leaned forward, his voice blunt and accusing. "Where did you get the drugs, Mrs. Williams?" Naomi's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "I didn't get them from anywhere," she shot back, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I've told you a dozen times this is a setup." Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the sheer effort of holding herself together. The second officer, broader and older, with a graying mustache that twitched as he spoke, leaned in closer. "Why would someone frame you? Do you have enemies?" His tone was skeptical, his eyes narrowing as if he'd already decided her guilt. Naomi hesitated, her mind racing back through the years Marcus's rise to power. The jealous colleagues, the whispered threats they'd laughed off as petty grudges. "My husband's position has made us targets before," she said slowly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "But I've never been involved in anything illegal." "Never." The officers exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. "Convenient." The first muttered, scribbling something in his notebook with a smirk that made Naomi's blood boil. "Are you even listening to me?" she snapped, her frustration spilling over. "Check the security footage, look into who handled my luggage." "We're doing our job, Mrs. Williams," the second officer replied curtly, his patience thinning. Naomi slumped back in the chair, the cold metal pressing against her spine as the walls seemed to close in. She felt trapped not just by the room, but by the weight of a system that refused to hear her. Back at the Williams home, chaos reigned. Outside, a crowd of protesters had swelled, their chants rising like a tidal wave. "Resign, Marcus." "Justice for Greenview." Signs bobbed above their heads, hastily scrawled with venomous phrases. While the air crackled with their fury, Marcus stood in the living room, his breath hitching as a brick sailed through the front window, shattering the glass into 1,000 glittering shards that rained across the hardwood floor. He ducked instinctively, his pulse racing, as another projectile rag soaked in gasoline and set ablaze landed near the fence outside. Flames licked at the dry wood, casting an orange glow across the yard. "Call the fire department," he shouted to his assistant, a young woman named Clara who'd been by his side through the crisis, her wide eyes reflecting the growing panic. Marcus grabbed a fire extinguisher from the hall closet, its weight grounding him as he bolted outside. The crowd jeered, their voices a cacophony of hate. "You're ruining this airport," one man yelled, his face contorted with rage. "We don't want your kind here," a woman screamed, hurling a chunk of debris that narrowly missed Marcus's head. He aimed the extinguisher at the flames, white foam hissing as it smothered the fire, his chest heaving with exertion. The crowd didn't relent. If anything, his presence seemed to embolden them, their shouts growing louder, more vicious. Police sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. Officers poured from their vehicles, pushing the mob back with practiced efficiency, establishing a shaky perimeter around the property. Marcus retreated inside, his hands trembling as he locked the door behind him. The house fell into an unnatural stillness, the muffled roar of the protesters bleeding through the walls. He sank onto the couch, his head dropping into his hands, Naomi's absence a crushing weight on his chest. He could still see her dragged away in handcuffs, her face a mask of shock and humiliation, surrounded by strangers who'd already judged her guilty. A sharp knock at the door jolted him upright, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. He opened it to find a police officer, his uniform crisp despite the madness outside. "Mr. Williams," the man said, his voice calm but firm, "we've secured the area for now, but this could escalate. I suggest you and your family consider staying elsewhere until it calms down." Marcus's jaw tightened. "My wife's in custody," he replied, his tone clipped. "I'm not going anywhere until she's home." The officer hesitated, then nodded, a flicker of sympathy crossing his face. "We keep watch," he said before stepping back into the night. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, the protests quieted slightly, though the tension lingered like a storm waiting to break. Inside, Marcus turned to the only thing he could control, finding answers. He spread documents across the dining table, mail chains, security logs, anything that might explain how drugs had ended up in Naomi's luggage. His phone buzzed, A headline flashing across the screen. Marcus Williams' wife arrested. Drug scandal rocks green. View Airport. The article was a venomous stew of speculation, peppered with quotes from Emily's press conference and thinly veiled accusations against him. His fists clenched, crumpling the edges of a memo in his hand. Emily had turned this into a circus, and the public was eating it up. The phone buzzed again, and he answered without looking, his voice tight. "Marcus?" Naomi's voice came through, strained and fragile, but alive. Relief flooded him, softening his tone. "Naomi, are you all right?" She let out a bitter laugh, the sound jagged with exhaustion. "I'm fine, but they're treating me like a criminal. You need to fix this. Marcusi can't stay here." Her words trembled with a vulnerability she rarely showed, and it tore at him. "I'm working on it," he promised, his resolve hardening. "I won't let them get away with this." There was a pause, then her voice dropped. "Marcus, I feel like I'm fighting this alone. The media, the protesters, it's too much. You're not alone," he said firmly. "We'll get through this." As the call ended, he stared at the phone, Emily's shadow looming larger in his mind. She'd declared war, and he'd fight with everything he had. The air in the house grew heavy, suffocating, as the chants outside seeped through the walls like a relentless tide. Naomi stood near the kitchen table, her arms crossed so tightly her nails dug into her skin, her face flushed with a fury she could no longer contain. "This is your fault, Marcus," she snapped, her voice rising above the muffled chaos. "You're the director. How could you let things spiral this far?" Her eyes blazed with accusation, every word a release of the terror and shame she'd bottled up since the airport. Marcus stood across the room, his own anger simmering beneath a mask of exhaustion, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white with the effort of holding back. "You think I wanted this?" he shot back, his voice raw with frustration. "You think I planned for my wife to be accused of smuggling drugs? For our lives to be torn apart like this?" His chest heaved, the weight of the day crashing down on him. Naomi's arrest, Emily's betrayal, the mob outside their home. "You didn't plan for anything," Naomi fired back, stepping closer, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've been so obsessed with expanding the airport, with kissing up to shareholders, that you let people like Jack and Emily run wild. Now look where we are. Look at what they've done to us." Her hands shook as she gestured toward the shattered window, the flickering glow of the still smoldering fence outside casting eerie shadows across the room. Marcus's jaw tightened, and he took a step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous edge. "Don't put this all on me, Naomi. Let's not forget those drugs were found in your luggage." The accusation slipped out before he could stop it, a spark igniting the dry tinder of their frayed nerves. Naomi's eyes widened, her lips parting as if he'd struck her. She took an involuntary step back, her breath catching. "You think I had something to do with this?" she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of his words. "I don't know what to think," Marcus exploded, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "This whole situation doesn't make sense, but until I figure it out, I can't rule anything out." His voice cracked, revealing the fear beneath his anger, fear that he'd lost control, that the woman he loved might be caught in a web he couldn't untangle. Naomi stared at him, disbelief etching lines into her face. "How dare you?" she said, her voice cold and cutting, each word deliberate. "After everything I've been through today, humiliated, manhandled, thrown in a cell, you're standing here questioning my integrity? Your wife?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat, choked by the realization of how deeply he'd wounded her. Naomi turned away, shaking her head, her shoulders trembling. "Maybe Emily's right," she muttered, the bitterness in her tone slicing through the silence. Marcus stiffened, his blood running cold. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded, stepping closer. She spun back to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Maybe you're not fit to run this airport," she said, her voice laced with venom, "because you clearly can't protect the people closest to you." The words landed like a blow, cutting deeper than Marcus could bear to admit. His chest tightened, a storm of guilt and rage swirling inside him, but before he could fire back, a deafening crash shattered the tension. Glass exploded inward from the front of the house, shards skittering across the floor like jagged rain. Naomi flinched, her voice sharp with alarm. What was that? Another crash followed, this time accompanied by muffled shouts from outside. Marcus moved swiftly to the window, peering through the blinds. His stomach dropped. "Oh no," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Outside, a group of masked figures had gathered near the porch, their silhouettes menacing against the flickering flames licking at the lawn. One wielded a baseball bat, its wood splintered from earlier strikes, while another clutched a crowbar, its metal gleaming in the firelight. A third figure hurled a Molotov cocktail, the bottle shattering against the fence with a burst of flame that illuminated the night. "They're trying to burn us out," Naomi cried, backing away from the window, her hands pressed to her mouth in horror. "Upstairs," Marcus ordered, his tone firm despite the panic clawing at his chest. "Lock the bedroom door." Naomi's eyes widened, fear warring with defiance. "What about you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "I'll handle this," he said, grabbing a heavy metal lamp from the side table, its weight a small comfort in his shaking hands. Before she could argue, the front door burst open with a thunderous crack, splintered wood flying inward as the masked intruders stormed inside, their shouts a chaotic roar. The room erupted into pandemonium. Nami's scream cut through the air as she bolted for the stairs, Marcus pivoting to face the intruders, the lamp raised like a weapon. Outside, the protesters' chants grew louder, a grim chorus to the unfolding violence. In that moment, the lesson of justice and the consequences of power's abuse crystallized. Emily's ambition had unleashed a chain of events that threatened to consume them all, and Marcus and Naomi were left to fight not just for their lives, but for the truth that could redeem them. The night erupted into chaos as the sound of obscenities pierced the air, mingling with the sharp crashes of furniture being smashed apart. Marcus stood like a sentinel at the base of the staircase, his broad frame a barrier between the intruders and the fragile sanctuary of the upper floor. In his trembling hands, he clutched a lamp, not the delicate kind meant for soft reading light, but a sturdy, old thing with a base heavy enough to double as a cudgel. His voice thundered through the house, raw and commanding, "Get out of my home." The words reverberated off the walls, carrying the weight of a man pushed beyond fear into fury. One of the shadowed figures, emboldened by malice, lunged at him, a bat swinging wildly through the air. Marcus didn't hesitate. With a surge of adrenaline, he brought the lamp down hard, its solid base crashing against the man's forearm. A sharp yelp broke through the din as the bat clattered to the floor, the attacker clutching his arm in agony, but the reprieve was fleeting. Another figure barreled into Marcus with the force of a charging beast, sending him sprawling to the hardwood below. The impact stole the breath from his lungs, and a grunt of pain escaped his lips as his head struck the ground. Naomi, halfway up the stairs, felt her heart seize at the sound. Her feet faltered, anchoring her in place as though the world had tilted beneath her. "Marcus," she screamed, her voice a jagged mix of terror and desperation. Her mind raced, torn between the instinct to rush to his side and the echo of his earlier command, ringing in her ears. "Go, Naomi," he bellowed again, his voice strained as he wrestled beneath the weight of his assailant. Her hesitation stretched into an agonizing eternity, her hands gripping the banister until her knuckles whitened. Then, with a sob caught in her throat, she turned and fled upward, the cacophony of splintering wood and furious shouts chasing her every step. Upstairs, she stumbled into the bedroom, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the key as she fumbled to lock the door. The metallic click felt like a lifeline, a flimsy shield against the violence below. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she snatched her phone from the nightstand, fingers trembling over the screen as she dialed 911. "My house is being attacked," she stammered to the operator, her voice quivering like a leaf in a storm. "There are people inside of there hurting my husband." The operator's calm response: "We're dispatching units now." MAM did little to steady the pounding of her heart, but it was a thread of hope she clung to desperately. Downstairs, Marcus fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal. With a Herculean effort, he heaved the intruder off him, rolling to his feet despite the searing pain radiating from his brow where a jagged cut wept blood. It trickled warm and sticky down his face, staining his vision red, but he paid it no mind. His eyes locked on a nearby chair, a sturdy oak piece, that had once hosted family dinner sand. He seized it, swinging it with all his might. The wood connected with another attacker's chest, sending him crashing back into the wall with a sickening thud. Plaster dust clouded the air as the man slumped, dazed. The distant wail of sirens sliced through the night, a sound that made the intruders freeze mid-motion. "Let's go," one of them barked, his voice sharp with urgency. They scrambled, snatching what they could shattered picture frames. A toppled vase before fleeing through the gaping wound of the front door, its frame splintered and broken. Moments later, the flashing lights of police cars bathed the house in red and blue as officers stormed the scene. The attackers had vanished into the night, leaving behind a battlefield, the front window shattered into a jagged maw, furniture strewn like the wreckage of a shipwreck, and a faint haze of smoke curling through the air, sharp and acrid. Naomi descended the stairs the instant she heard the sirens, her legs trembling beneath her as she raced to Marcus. She found him slumped against the wall, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his brow onto the torn fabric of his shirt. "Oh my God, Marcus," she whispered, her voice breaking as she hurried to his side, hands hovering over him as if afraid to touch. "I'm fine," he growled, brushing her off with a roughness that belied the exhaustion in his eyes. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though tears welled up, spilling over as the terror of the night crashed over her. "They were going to kill us," she choked out. Marcus's jaw tightened, his voice steady despite the chaos. "But they didn't, because we don't go down that easily." A police officer approached, his notepad in hand, eyes scanning the devastation with a practiced detachment. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams will conduct a full investigation and station security here for the next few days, but I'd strongly suggest relocating for your safety." Marcus shook his head, his defiance cutting through the haze of pain. "This is our home. I'm not running." The officer's nod was curt, but his skeptical glance lingered as he turned away. As the police filtered out, the silence that settled between Marcus and Naomi was heavy, oppressive, a stark contrast to the earlier clamor. Naomi broke it first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, I'm sorry." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "For what?" She swallowed hard, the guilt she'd buried rising to the surface. "For blaming you. You didn't deserve that." Marcus sighed, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of the night had finally settled into his bones. "And I shouldn't have doubted you. You've been through hell already without me piling on." They stood amid the ruins of their living room, the air thick with unspoken fears and fragile trust. "We need to fight back," Marcus said at last, his voice hardening with resolve. "Not just for us, but for everyone Emily's trying to destroy." Naomi's eyes met his, a spark of determination igniting within her. "Then let's make sure she pays." Weeks later, the courtroom buzzed with a restless energy, a hive of whispered theories and stifled outrage. Naomi sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped so tightly her nails bit into her palms, a futile attempt to anchor herself against the storm of accusations. Across the room, Emily Harper lounged among her legal team, her posture radiating an infuriating smugness, as if the proceedings were a game she'd already won. The bailiff's voice cut through the tension. "All rise," and the room fell silent as the judge entered, his presence commanding obedience. Once seated, his stern gaze swept over the prosecution. "Proceed." Emily's lead attorney rose, a man whose every movement exuded precision, his voice smooth and cutting. "Your Honor, the evidence against Mrs. Williams is undeniable. We have surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and physical proof tying her to drug smuggling." Naomi's lawyer, Karina, a young woman with fire in her eye, shot to her feet. "Your Honor, we assert that this evidence has been manipulated. My client is being framed by those exploiting her husband's role as airport director." The prosecutor's lips curled into a smirk. "A convenient excuse. Let's begin with the footage." A screen lowered from the ceiling, and the grainy video flickered to life. It showed Naomi at the baggage counter, a security officer placing her suitcase on the belt. Moments later, the angle shifted, revealing an identical bag being opened to expose a package of white powder. "That's not my bag." Naomi burst out, unable to contain the panic clawing at her chest. The judge's gavel slammed down. "Mrs. Williams, you will remain silent unless addressed." She bit her lip, her heart hammering as Karen rose again. "Your Honor, the footage skips key moments, and there's no direct link to my client." "Objection." The prosecutor snapped. "The footage is clear." Sustained. The judge ruled. "Proceed." The prosecution pressed on, summoning Jack Hayes, a weary security officer with a cold, detached air. He recounted the airport incident with calculated distortions, painting Naomi as belligerent and evasive. Karen pounced during cross-examination. "Mr. Hayes, you say my client resisted arrest. Isn't it true you used excessive force?" Hayes smirked, unfazed. "I followed protocol." "She was aggressive." Karen leaned in, her voice sharp. "Aggressive or defending herself from your overreach." "Objection." The prosecutor barked. "Sustained." The judge intoned. "Keep to the facts, Ms. Hill." Karen's jaw tightened, but she stepped back, knowing she'd sown seeds of doubt. As the trial wore on, Emily's team piled on falsified logs and twisted statements. Each lie a brick in the wall closing around Naomi. Her hope flickered, dimming under the onslaught. Outside, the courthouse steps teemed with chaos, protesters clashing, signs waving like battle flags. "Justice for Naomi," one side roared, while the other sneered, "Lock her up." Police formed a human wall, their faces grim as the two factions shoved and shouted. When the session adjourned, Naomi emerged, flanked by Marcus and Karen, into a swarm of reporters. Microphones jabbed at her like weapons. "Mrs. Williams, how do you answer the drug charges?" "Mr. Williams, do you still stand by her?" She kept her head down, clinging to Marcus's arm as they pushed toward their car. Then chaos erupted anew. A group of masked figures burst from the crowd, shoving past police lines. "There she is," one shouted. An arm grabbed Naomi, yanking her back, but Marcus was faster, throwing himself between them. "Get off her," he roared, his fists swinging with primal force. Another attacker swung a baton, the wood whizzing past Naomi's head as she ducked. Marcus seized it midair, wrenching it free and turning it against its owner. The scene dissolved into pandemonium, scattering, police surging forward. Naomi stumbled back, gasping, when a hand clamped around her from behind. Before she could scream, a voice rang out. "Let her go." Odin, Emily's assistant, appeared from the fray. Tackling the assailant with surprising strength, he wrestled the man's weapon away, pinning him until officers swarmed in. As the attackers were subdued, Naomi leaned against the car, trembling. Marcus pulled her close, his breath ragged. "Are you okay?" She nodded, tears brimming. "I thought they'd kill me." Marcus turned to Odin, suspicion warring with gratitude. "Why'd you help us?" Odin glanced around, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Not here. But I have something you need to see." Later, in the dim light of Marcus's study, Odin spread out a trove of evidence across the desk: photos, bank records, emails, a flash drive glinting like a promise. His hands shook as he spoke. "This is everything. Proof Emily orchestrated it all." Marcus's eyes narrowed, the lesson sinking in. Justice wasn't just a right, it was a fight. And the abuse of power carried a cost that Emily would soon learn. In the dimly lit office of Greenview International Airport, Odin's voice cut through the stillness like a blade, low and unwavering, as he unraveled a truth that had festered in the shadows for months. "Emily's been entangled with a cartel," he said, his words deliberate, each syllable heavy with the weight of betrayal. "She's been orchestrating a smuggling ring right under our noses, pushing drugs through this airport like it's her personal highway. And that's not the worst of it. She's been plotting to pin it all on Naomi, to shatter her reputation and seize control for herself." His gaze flickered to Marcus, who stood hunched over a cluttered desk, his broad shoulders tense as he sifted through a damning pile of evidence. Photos spilled across the surface, Emily shaking hands with a notorious cartel kingpin. Under the flicker of a street lamp, her neat signature scrawled across contracts that reeked of deceit, and a meticulously drawn blueprint outlining her scheme to frame Naomi. Marcus's fingers tightened around the edges of a file, his knuckles whitening as fury simmered beneath his calm exterior. "This isn't just corruption," he growled, his voice a low rumble of outrage. "She's built a goddamn criminal empire right here, in my airport." His eyes burned with a mix of disbelief and resolve, the sting of betrayal cutting deeper than he'd ever admit. Odin nodded solemnly, tapping a small flash drive that lay innocently on the tablia device so unassuming yet brimming. With the power to topple Emily's carefully constructed Fuade. She's been clever, covering every step, but this is her undoing. It's a recording of her laying out the whole plan, word for word. Beside Marcus, Naomi sat rigid, her hands balled into fists so tight her nails bit into her palms. Her breath came in sharp, shallow bursts as she processed the depth of Emily's treachery, not just a colleague's betrayal, but a calculated assault on her life, her family, her very existence. "We can't wait," she said, her voice trembling with urgency and rage. "We have to expose her now, before she buries us all." Marcus straightened, his jaw set like steel. A man forged anew in the fire of this revelation. "I'll call a press conference," he declared, his tone unshakable. "The world needs to know what's been rotting in Greenview." 2 hours later, the airport's press room buzzed with restless energy. Marcus stood at the podium, a towering figure flanked by Naomi and Odin, his presence commanding despite the storm raging within him. Cameras flashed incessantly, their sharp clicks punctuating the air like gunfire, while reporters jostled shoulder to shoulder, their notebooks poised like weapons. "Thank you all for being here," Marcus began, his voice steady but threaded with a quiet fury that demanded attention. "Today, I'm not just defending my wife against baseless accusations. I'm exposing a cancer that's been eating away at Greenview International Airport." He gestured to a screen behind him, its glow illuminating the room as the first piece of evidence flickered to life. "What you're about to see implicates Deputy Director Emily Harper in a web of drug smuggling and a vicious plot to frame Naomi Williams, my wife." The room erupted in gasps as the audio from Odin's flash drive crackled through the speakers. Emily's voice, cold, precise, venomous, filled the space. "Plant the drugs in Naomi's bag. Make sure the footage is flawless. Once Marcus is disgraced, I'll take over the airport. The cartel will handle the rest." Chaos exploded like a dam bursting. Reporters shouted over one another, their voices a frantic tangle of shock and indignation, while Marcus raised a hand, his calm authority slicing through the uproar. "This is just the beginning. We've handed everything, recordings, documents, photos to the authorities. Justice will not be denied." As the conference dissolved, a fleeting spark of hope flickered in Marcus's chest, though he knew the battle was far from won. Across the airport, in the sterile glow of her office, Emily sat motionless, her eyes fixed on a muted television broadcasting Marcus's every word. Her face was a mask of composure, but beneath it, a tempest churned for rage and the bitter taste of exposure. Her fingers hovered over her phone, hesitating only a moment before she dialed a number she'd hoped never to need. "They're coming for me," she said, her voice clipped and icy. "Odin's turned on us. Take him out." On the other end, a gravelly voice replied with chilling indifference. "It's as good as done." She hung up, her pulse racing as she stared at the screen. Marcus's resolute figure a haunting reminder of her crumbling empire. Outside, the night draped the airport parking lot in a shroud of shadows as Odin stepped into the cool air, his briefcase swinging lightly in his grip. The press conference had unfolded like clockwork, but a gnawing unease clung to him, a weight pressing against his ribs. He scanned the lot, his senses sharpened by the stillness that felt too deliberate, too oppressive. His car loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the faint glow of a distant streetlight. Then, a flickera shadow darting between two parked vehicles. Before he could react, a figure lunged from the darkness, a metal pipe slicing through the air toward his skull. Odin's instincts kicked in. He ducked, the pipe whizzing past his ear and crashing against his car's hood with a deafening clang. "Damn it," he hissed, his briefcase slipping from his hand as he bolted. Another shadow emerged, this one wielding a knife that glinted wickedly in the dim light. Odin's heart hammered against his chest, adrenaline surging as he pivoted and sprinted toward the lot's exit. Footsteps pounded behind him, relentless and closing in. Ahead, a security guard patrolled lazily near the entrance, his flashlight cutting lazy arcs through the gloom. "Help," Odin shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "They're trying to kill me." The guard spun, his beam locking onto the scene. "Hey, stop right there," he barked, and the attackers faltered. their silhouettes melting back into the night. Odin stumbled to a halt, collapsing against a wall, his breath ragged as the guard approached, concern etching his weathered face. "You okay?" Sir Odin straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "I will be, but this is just the beginning." The next morning, in a private conference room bathed in pale sunlight, Odin faced Marcus and Naomi, his face drawn and pale, a fresh cut on his cheek a stark reminder of the previous night's ambush. "Emily's desperate," he said, his voice blunt and weary. "She sent them after me in the parking lot. They nearly succeeded." Naomi's eyes widened, a storm of fear and fury swirling within her. "She won't stop until you're dead," she whispered, her hands trembling. Marcus's jaw clenched, his mind racing as he pieced together the unraveling threads of Emily's collapse. "She's losing control," he said, his tone sharp with determination. "That means we're close to ending this." Odin set his phone on the table, its screen glowing faintly. "I've already spoken to the police. I'll testify in court. But we need to brace ourselves. Emily's not going down without a fight." Marcus met his gaze, his features carved with resolve. "Then we'll be ready for whatever she throws at us." Days later, the courtroom crackled with tension, an electric hum that seemed to vibrate through the wooden benches and stern faces of the onlookers. Odin stood at the witness stand, his voice steady as he presented the final, irrefutable evidence against Emily. Audio clips of her chilling commands, bank records tracing cartel payments, and testimonies from shaken accomplices. The judge leaned forward, his stern gaze unyielding, while Emily's once smug defense attorney fidgeted, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the truth. At the defendant's table, Emily sat rigid, her jaw locked tight, her eyes blazing with a fury that masked the dread creeping into her core. She could feel the walls closing in, the empire she'd built slipping through her fingers like sand. When the judge called for a recess, she shot to her feet, her composure shattering. "Miss Harper, sit down," a bailiff warned, stepping closer, but she was already moving, shoving past a startled court clerk and bolting for the exit. "She's running," someone yelled, and the room dissolved into pandemonium as officers scrambled after her. Emily burst into the blinding sunlight outside the courthouse, her heels striking the pavement with frantic urgency as she plunged into a sea of protesters and reporters. Shouts of "There she is," and "Stop her," trailed behind her, mingling with the roar of pursuing footsteps. She tore off her jacket, flinging it into a dumpster as she darted into a narrow side street, her breath burning in her lungs. Her mind raced, clawing for a plan to escape the noose tightening around her. She wove through bustling alleys and crowded intersections, her once pristine appearance now disheveled, her hair whipping wildly in the wind. Behind her, Marcus and Odin emerged from the courthouse, their eyes locking onto the chaos she'd left in her wake. "She's running," Marcus said, his voice taut with urgency. "We can't let her slip away." Odin was already moving, his strides purposeful as they pushed into the fray. Emily's flight led her to a teeming market street, alive with the clamor of vendors hawking wares and pedestrians haggling over prices. She shoved through the throng, ignoring the indignant shouts and curses that followed her. A glance over her shoulder revealed the police closing in, their uniforms flashing through the crowd like hounds on a scent. She ducked into another alley, her chest heaving, and spotted an open door leading into a cavernous, abandoned warehouse. Slipping inside, she crouched behind a stack of rotting crates, her breath shallow and ragged, the musty air thick in her throat. Moments later, Marcus and Odin followed, their footsteps reverberating through the hollow space. "She's here," Odin whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. Marcus nodded, gripping a rusted metal pipe he'd snatched from the alley, his eyes scanning the shadows. The silence stretched, oppressive and suffocating, until a sudden crash shattered it. Emily emerged from the darkness, a pistol trembling in her hands, its barrel aimed squarely at Marcus. "Don't move," she hissed, her voice a venomous snarl. Marcus froze, his hands rising slowly, his mind racing for a way to defuse the standoff. "Emily, it's over," he said, his tone measured but firm. "There's no escape left." Her eyes darted to Odin, wild with rage. "And you backstabbing rat. I should have ended you when I had the chance." Odin stood his ground, unflinching. "You've lost." Emily, you can't shoot your way out of this. Her grip tightened, her finger hovering over the trigger. Watch me. Sirens wailed closer, their piercing cries flooding the warehouse as red and blue lights danced across the grimy walls. Emily dropped the weapon. A voice boomed through a megaphone, authoritative and unyielding. Officers swarmed the building, their silhouettes filling the doorways. Her face twisted in frustration, her gaze flickering between Marcus and Odin, searching for a lifeline that didn't exist. It's over, Marcus repeated, taking a cautious step forward. Don't make this worse. Stay back, she screamed, the gun shaking violently in her grasp. For a fleeting moment, surrender seemed possible. Her shoulders slumped, the weight of her defeat pressing down. But then, with a guttural roar, she swung the barrel toward Odin. Before she could fire, a sharp crack split the air. A sniper's bullet from outside shattered the gun in her hand, sending it clattering to the floor. Emily shrieked, clutching her bloodied fingers as officers stormed in, shouting, on the ground. Now, she crumpled to her knees, her defiance extinguished, replaced by the hollow shell of a woman undone. As they cuffed her and dragged her to her feet, she twisted to glare at Marcus and Odin, her eyes alight with a hatred that burned brighter than her fear. This isn't over, she spat, her voice dripping with venom. You think you've won, but they'll come for you just like they'll come for me. Marcus met her stare, unyielding, his voice calm but resolute. Let them try. As she was led away, the weight of justice settled over the scene, not a triumphant victory, but a sobering reminder of its cost. Emily's fall was a lesson carved in blood and betrayal. Power, when wielded without conscience, inevitably consumes itself, leaving only wreckage in its wake. For Marcus, Naomi, and Odin, the fight had been won, but the scars it left whispered of battles yet to come. The air was thick with tension as the police snapped the cuffs around Emily's wrists, her defiant glare cutting through the chaos like a blade. They ushered her into the back of the squad car, its red and blue lights pulsing rhythmically in the dim evening light. Odin stood there, his chest heaving as he let out a shaky breath, the weight of what had just unfolded pressing down on him. That was too damn close, he muttered, his voice barely steady. Beside him, Marcus gave a slow nod, his hand clamping down on Odin's shoulder with a grip that spoke of gratitude and exhaustion. You pulled us out of the fire, man. Bringing this mess into the open, you saved us all. His words carried a quiet intensity. But as they turned to step out of the shadowed precinct and into the cool night, the enormity of what lay ahead loomed over them like a storm cloud ready to break. Emily's arrest had been a hard-won victory, a jagged shard of light piercing through months of darkness. Yet her final word, sharp, venomous, and dripping with warning, echoed in their minds, refusing to fade. Odin's gut churned with unease. He could still hear her voice, low and deliberate, promising that this was far from over. Marcus felt it too, a gnawing certainty that this was merely the opening act of a much larger battle. They'd torn the mask off her operation, but the roots ran deep, tangled in shadows they hadn't yet reached. The first real sign of trouble came late the next evening. Marcus was holed up in his office at Greenview Airport, a cluttered space filled with the hum of machinery and the faint scent of jet fuel seeping through the walls. Papers littered his desk, repair schedules for the damage Emily's schemes had left behind, a map of the terminal marked with red ink. He rubbed his temples, the fatigue settling into his bones, when the security monitor on his desk flickered to life. His eyes narrowed as the grainy feed revealed a chilling sight. A group of masked figures, clad in black, moving with cold precision through the restricted hallways. Their weapons glinted under the fluorescent lights, and their steps were purposeful, predatory. Odin burst through the door a heartbeat later, phone pressed to his ear, his face taut with alarm. We've got a breach, he snapped, jabbing a finger at the screen. They're heading straight for the evidence vault. Marcus shot to his feet, snatching the radio from his desk with a swiftness that belied his exhaustion. This is Marcus Williams, he barked into it, his voice cutting through the static. All security teams, converge on Section C1 to now. We've got intruders targeting critical evidence. The airport's PA system crackled to life, blaring the alert across the sprawling terminal. Marcus spun to Odin, his jaw set. Police on their way, Odin nodded, but his expression was grim. Yeah, but they're 10 minutes out at best. Marcus's eyes darkened, a flicker of resolve hardening his features. Then it's on us to stop them. He grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and a heavy baton from a cabinet, its weight solid and reassuring in his hand. There was no hesitation, only the raw, unshakable determination to protect what they'd fought so hard to uncover. The intruders had already reached the baggage handling area, a cavernous space lined with towering stacks of crates and the constant rumble of conveyor belts. The evidenza boxes of documents, recordings, and contraband tied to Emily's smuggling ring was locked away here, a treasure trove of truth they couldn't afford to lose. The group moved like a well-oiled machine, unpacking explosives and wiring them to the storage lockers with chilling efficiency. Their leader, a tall man with a jagged scar slicing across his cheek, barked orders in a voice that carried the edge of a man used to being obeyed. 3 minutes, he growled, glancing at the glowing digits on his watch. Then we're gone. Another figure, nimble and focused, knelt by a detonator, threading wires with steady hands. But a faint sound echo of boots on concrete made them freeze. Someone's coming, a woman hissed, her grip tightening on her weapon, her breath quickening with nervous energy. Hold your ground, Scarface ordered, ducking behind a crate, his eyes scanning the shadows. Marcus and Odin arrived moments later, flanked by 2 armed security guards whose faces were etched with a mix of fear and resolve. They crouched behind a dormant conveyor belt, the cold metal pressing against their knees as they sized up the scene. Odin peeked over the edge, his heart pounding in his chest. At least 6 of them, he whispered, his voice low but urgent, and they're rigging explosives. Marcus's jaw clenched, his mind racing. That evidence was their lifeline, the key to dismantling Emily's empire for good. We can't let them destroy it, he said, his tone steely. We'll split up. Odin, you take the left flank with 1 guard. I'll go right with the other. The team nodded, slipping into the shadows, using the maze of machinery and crates as cover to close the gap. Marcus's pulse thundered in his ears as he crept forward, the baton slick with sweat in his grip. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured, the adrenaline flooding his system like wildfire. Then a shout shattered the silence. They're here, one of the intruders yelled, swinging his weapon up. Gunfire erupted, a deafening roar that bounced off the concrete walls and sent sparks flying from the metal around them. Marcus dove behind a pile of luggage, his heart slamming against his ribs as bullets whizzed past. Odin and his guard fired back from their position, their shots precise and relentless, pinning down 2 of the attackers in a hail of lead. Marcus caught the second guard's eye and gestured toward the explosives. We've got to disarm those charges, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. The guard nodded, laying down cover fire as Marcus edged closer to the detonator. Scarface spotted him, his scarred face twisting into a snarl. Not so fast, hero, he spat, swinging his gun toward Marcus and firing. The shot grazed the air inches from Marcus's head, forcing him to duck behind a pillar, sweat stinging his eyes. Odin, cover me, Marcus shouted. Odin responded instantly, unleashing a burst of rounds that drove Scarface back. Seizing the moment, Marcus lunged forward, his fingers closing around the detonator. With a desperate yank, he ripped the wires free, the device falling silent in his hands. Scarface roared in fury, charging at Marcus with a knife glinting in the dim light. Marcus dodged the first wild slash, swinging the baton to deflect the next. They clashed in a brutal dance, grappling with feral intensity. Give it up, Marcus grunted, locking eyes with the man, their breaths ragged. Never. Scarface hissed, driving his knee into Marcus's ribs. Pain flared through Marcus's side, but he pushed through it, landing a crushing blow to Scarface's wrist. The knife hit the ground with a clatter, and Marcus swung again, knocking the man out cold. Across the room, Odin and the guards were wrapping up their fight. A masked woman fired wildly, her shots erratic as panic set in, but Odin circled around, closing the distance. With a swift strike from the butt of his gun, he brought her down, her weapon skittering across the floor. The last 2 intruders bolted for the exit, their footsteps pounding against the concrete. But the reinforcements arrived just in time, airport security flooding the area, cutting off their escape. Within moments, all 6 attackers were subdued, their wrists bound, their plans in ruins. The baggage area was a mess, overturned crates, scattered bullet casings, and the acrid tang of smoke lingering in the air. Marcus slumped against a crate, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. Odin approached, his face lined with concern. "You okay?" Marcus nodded, wincing as he pressed a hand to his bruised ribs. "I'll live." "Did we get them all?" "All accounted for," Odin confirmed, a faint smile breaking through. "The evidence is safe thanks to you." Marcus exhaled heavily, relief washing over him like a tide. "This ends now," he said, his voice firm. "We're tearing down every last piece of Emily's operation." As the police rolled in to haul the intruders away, Marcus and Odin stepped out into the terminal. The night air hit them like a bomb, crisp and cool against their sweat-soaked skin. A car screeched to a halt nearby, and Naomi leapt out, her face pale with worry. "I heard what happened," she said, rushing to Marcus's side, her voice trembling. "Are you hurt?" He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, meeting her gaze. "I'm fine," he assured her. "But this airport's seen enough chaos, it's time to rebuild." Naomi's eyes hardened with the same resolve he felt. "We'll do it together," she said, and in that moment, their shared strength felt unbreakable. The next morning, the headlines shifted. Papers that had once smeared Marcus and Naomi with lies now sang a different tune, innocent and victorious. Marcus and Naomi Williams cleared of all allegations. Marcus watched the news flicker across his office TV, a reporter detailing Emily's arrest and the collapse of her smuggling ring. Satisfaction stirred in his chest, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the first step. Naomi stepped in, tossing a newspaper onto his desk with a thud. Her face was a mask, unreadable, but her voice carried a quiet weight. "It's good to see the truth out there," she said, "but it doesn't wipe away what they put us through." Marcus nodded, his expression solemn. "No, but it's a start. Now we take this and make something real out of it." The following day, Marcus stood before the airport's executive board, a room of suits who'd once doubted him. The air was heavy with expectation as he began, his voice calm but unyielding. "We've seen what happens when we ignore the rot in our systems. This airport won't be a haven for corruption, discrimination, or abuse anymore." He clicked through slides: new policies, mandatory training on diversity and inclusion, a clear process for complaints, oversight to keep power in check. The board members shifted in their seats, exchanging looks, but they nodded in agreement. Marcus closed with a final, unwavering statement. "These aren't suggestions, they're requirements. If you don't like it, there's the door." No one moved. Outside, the terminal buzzed with a new energy. A crowd had gathered at the angry mobs of weeks past, but supporters waving signs: justice for Naomi, equality for all, no more corruption. Naomi walked among them, her heart swelling as she read the messages. A man approached, his young daughter clinging to his hand. "Mrs. Williams," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "thank you for standing up. People like us need someone like you." Naomi crouched down, smiling at the girl. "Don't ever let anyone tell you your voice doesn't matter," she said softly. The crowd erupted in cheers as she took the stage, gripping the microphone with steady hands. "We've been through hell," she began, her voice ringing out, "but we're still standing. And we're not just fighting for us, we're fighting for everyone who's been silenced or pushed aside." The air filled with shouts of support, and Naomi raised her fist, a symbol of defiance and hope. That evening, Marcus and Naomi returned home. The broken windows were fixed, the graffiti gone, but the scars of the attacks lingered in the quiet. Marcus poured two glasses of wine, handing one to Naomi. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice soft but resolute. She took the glass, her eyes meeting his. "We have," she agreed, "and we're not done yet." They stood together, the weight of their journey settling around them, not just a fight for survival, but a lesson in justice. Power, when abused, crumbled under its own weight, and they'd proven it. The road ahead was long, but they'd walk it side by side, determined to build something better from the ashes. The evening air carried a faint chill as Marcus raised his glass, the crystal catching the soft glow of the dining room lights. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice warm with conviction, his eyes reflecting a quiet hope for what lay ahead. Naomi, seated across from him, lifted her own glass, the clink of their toast reverberating through the room like a promise. "To a better Greenview," she added, her tone resolute yet tinged with the weight of battles fought and won. Odin, sitting between them, offered a small, tentative smile, his fingers tightening around the stem of his glass. "And to never forgetting how far we've come," he murmured, his words heavy with the memories of struggle that still lingered in his mind. The three of them sat in companionable silence for a moment, the clinking of their glasses a quiet symphony of resilience and renewal. The following week unfolded with a flurry of purpose. Naomi found herself in a sleek, modern meeting room, surrounded by a diverse group of lawyers in crisp suits, activists with fire in their eyes, and community leaders whose weathered faces told stories of perseverance. She sat at the head of the table, her posture straight, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she fought to steady the nervous energy pulsing through her veins. "I want to establish a foundation," she began, her voice cutting through the hum of anticipation in the room, "one that provides legal aid and emotional support for victims of discrimination and abuse." "What happened to me?" She paused, her throat tightening as the memories of humiliation and helplessness flooded back. "It can't happen to anyone else." Her words hung in the air, igniting a spark of agreement among the group. Ideas poured forth like a river breaking free of its banks. Proposals for outreach programs, funding strategies, and partnerships. Naomi leaned forward, her dark eyes blazing with determination. "We'll call it the Justice Initiative," she declared, her voice growing firmer with each syllable. "And it won't just stop at airports. It'll fight for equality everywhere, every street, every workplace, every corner of this world where people are wronged." The room buzzed with energy, a chorus of voices rising in support, and Naomi felt a flicker of pride swell in her chest. This was more than a plan, it was a vow. Across town, in the heart of Greenview International Airport, Marcus stood at the head of a long, polished conference table, the weight of leadership pressing down on his broad shoulders. The senior leadership team sat before him, a sea of attentive faces, some curious, others guarded, all waiting for the words that would shape their future. At the far end of the table, Odin sat with his back ramrod straight, his hands resting calmly in his lap. But beneath that composed exterior, his heart thudded against his ribs, a steady drumbeat of anticipation and unease. Marcus swept his gaze across the room, his jaw set as he prepared to deliver a truth that had been months in the making. "The events of the past few weeks have laid bare the cracks in our leadership structure," he began, his deep voice resonating with authority. "Weaknesses that nearly brought this airport to its knees, tarnishing its name and its people. But amid that chaos, we've witnessed something extraordinary: acts of courage and integrity from those who refused to bend under pressure." His eyes flicked to Odin, a brief but deliberate acknowledgement, before he pressed on. "It's time for a shift, effective immediately. Odin Carter will step into the role of Deputy Director of Greenview International Airport." A ripple of surprise coursed through the room. Murmurs broke out. A few hesitant claps punctuated the air, and sidelong glances darted between colleagues. Marcus raised a hand, his expression unyielding, silencing the unrest with a single gesture. "This isn't up for debate," he said, his tone as solid as stone. "Odin's actions pulled this airport back from the brink of collapse. He didn't just protect our operations, safeguarded our values. His integrity, his bravery, his unwavering commitment to justice have earned him this position. I have full faith that he'll guide us toward a stronger, more honorable future." All eyes turned to Odin as he rose from his chair, the weight of every gaze pressing against him like a physical force. His steps were measured as he crossed the room, each one echoing with the gravity of the moment. Marcus extended a hand, his grip firm and steady. "Congratulations, Odin. You've more than earned this." Odin met his handshake with equal strength, though his chest tightened with a swirl of gratitude and responsibility. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging within. "Thank you for trusting me with this. I won't let you down or this airport." Later, as the meeting adjourned, Odin followed Marcus into his office, the heavy door clicking shut behind them. The professional mask Odin had worn in the boardroom slipped away, revealing a man wrestling with the enormity of his new path. He stood before Marcus, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, and took a deep breath. Marcus, he began, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. I need to say something. When I started working under Emily, I didn't believe in leadership, not really. She was ruthless, cold, and I thought that was what it took to succeed. I saw power as a weapon, not a responsibility. But watching you, seeing how you fought for what's right, even when it could have cost you everything, it's turned everything I thought I knew upside down. Marcus leaned back against his desk, arms crossed, his weathered face softening as he studied Odin. And what do you see now? He asked, his tone gentle but probing. Odin met his gaze, his eyes clear and resolute. That leadership isn't about wielding power, it's about owning up to your choices. It's about shielding the people who depend on you, not crushing them to get ahead. That's the kind of leader I want to be. A faint smile tugged at Marcus's lips, a glimmer of pride breaking through his stoic demeanor. Then you're already halfway there, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of a mentor's approval. Odin nodded, a quiet determination settling into his bones. I won't let this chance slip through my fingers, he vowed. My first step is rebuilding trust among the staff, the passengers, the community. Emily's shadow still lingers, but I'll burn it away, piece by piece. Marcus stepped forward, clapping a hand on Odin's shoulder, his grip steady and reassuring. I know you will, he said, and the confidence in his words fueled Odin's resolve. Days later, Odin stood before the airport security team in the early morning light. The briefing room bathed in the soft glow of dawn filtering through high windows. Rows of uniformed officers faced him, their expressions a mix of wariness and skepticism. Many had served under Emily, their trust battered by years of her iron-fisted rule. Odin could feel their doubts pressing against him, a silent challenge he knew he'd have to meet head-on. He squared his shoulders, his voice cutting through the stillness with a calm, unshakable clarity. I know what's running through your minds, he said, his gaze sweeping the room. You're wondering if I'm just another empty suit, here to feed you promises and walk away. I'm not. I've stood where you stand. I've seen what happens when leadership crumbles and the people at the top care more about their titles than the lives they're meant to protect. That ends now. Not on my watch, and not on yours. He took a step forward, his boots clicking against the tiled floor, his presence commanding yet approachable. This airport doesn't just need better policies or tighter security, it needs a heartbeat. It needs people brave enough to call out what's wrong from the ground up. It needs accountability woven into every layer. And it needs every one of you to take pride in the work you don't just for a paycheck, but because it matters. A few heads nodded, the tension in the room loosening like a knot slowly unraveling. Odin's eyes hardened with purpose as he issued his final charge. We're not just patching up an airport, we're raising a standard. If you're with me, let's roll up our sleeves and get it done. As the team dispersed, their murmurs of cautious optimism trailing behind them, a veteran officer approached Odin. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back tightly, her weathered face etched with decades of experience. She planted herself in front of him, arms crossed, her sharp eyes sizing him up. You've got a mountain to climb, Carter, she said bluntly, her voice rough around the edges, but carrying a grudging respect. A lot to prove. Odin didn't flinch, meeting her stare with steady resolve. I know, he replied, his tone unwavering. And I will. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a curt nod before turning away, her steps echoing with the weight of someone who'd seen too much, but hadn't given up hope entirely. That evening, Marcus and Naomi welcomed Odin into their home, the aroma of roasted herbs and warm bread wafting through the air. It was the first time the trio had gathered without the specter of crisis looming over them, and the shift felt almost surreal. They sat around a sturdy oak table, the clatter of plates and the soft hum of conversation filling the space. Marcus lifted his glass once more, his smile genuine and unguarded. To new beginnings, he toasted again, the words carrying a deeper resonance now. Naomi chimed in, her glass meeting his with a delicate clink. To a better Greenview, Odin's faint smile returned, though his mind churned with the road ahead daunting, yes, but brimming with possibility. And a never forgetting how far we've come, he added, his voice a quiet anchor amid the celebration. Meanwhile, Naomi's vision was taking root in a newly renovated building on the edge of town. The faint scent of fresh paint clung to the air as she stood beneath a simple sign that read the Justice Initiative, a safe haven for equality. Months of tireless effort, late-night strategy sessions, fundraising drives that tested her patience, and countless meetings with lawyers, activists, and community leaders had brought her dream to life. She ran her fingers along the edge of a desk, her chest swelling with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. A young staff member, Mrs. Williams, broke through her reverie, her voice bright with urgency. "The first batch of case files just arrived, ma'am. You'll want to see them." Naomi straightened, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she nodded. "Bring them to my office. We'll go through them together." Her modest workspace was a testament to her mission. Stacks of folders lined the desk, each one a story of injustice waiting to be righted. She picked up the top file, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the details. A young man falsely accused of theft, his future teetering on the edge of ruin. Her jaw tightened, a familiar anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "Set up a meeting with his family," she instructed, her voice firm. "I want to hear their story straight from them." Mrs. Williams nodded briskly, her heels clicking against the floor as she hurried out, leaving Naomi alone with the weight of her purpose. That afternoon, Naomi stood at the front of the center's largest conference room, addressing a crowd of dozens who had gathered for the first community seminar. The chairs were filled with faces reflecting a spectrum of emotion: hope, apprehension, quiet determination. She gripped the podium, her knuckles whitening as she steadied herself against the tide of memories threatening to pull her under. "I started the Justice Initiative because I know what it's like to feel powerless," she began, her voice ringing out with a strength born of survival. "To be judged not for who you are, but for what others decide you must be. I've stood in that darkness, and I swore I'd never let it swallow anyone else. But hear me when I say this, you are not powerless. Together we can push back against discrimination, against injustice, against a system that's left too many broken for too long." The room erupted in applause, a wave of sound that crashed over her, and for a fleeting moment, pride pierced through her usual composure. She exhaled, her shoulders relaxing as she realized this was only the beginning. As weeks turned into months, the Justice Initiative grew roots. Volunteers from legal firms offered their expertise pro bono, their briefcases and sharp suits a stark contrast to the grassroots energy of the activists. Hosting workshops on civil rights, counselors set up quiet corners for those grappling with the scars of trauma, their gentle voices a balm to frayed nerves. Naomi threw herself into the work, often burning the midnight oil to pour over case files or draft plans for the next outreach. The hours were grueling, but they filled a void left by the nightmare that had once consumed her life at the airport. One afternoon, as she wrestled with a particularly naughty Cassia, single mother denied housing due to baseless prejudice, Marcus appeared in her doorway, a stack of letters in his hands. "These just came in," he said, setting them on her desk with a soft thud. "From people you've helped." Curiosity piqued, Naomi reached for the first envelope, unfolding a handwritten note. "Dear Mrs. Williams," it began, the ink slightly smudged as if written in haste. "Because of you, my son is home. You didn't just give us a lawyer, you gave us hope. Thank you for standing up for people like us." Her hands shook as she read, emotion swelling in her throat. She opened another. "Your fight inspires me every day. I was ready to give up, but your strength reminded me justice is worth the battle." By the third letter, tears blurred her vision, and she set it down, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I feel like it's not enough," she confessed, glancing at Marcus. "But these said they remind me why I keep going." He smiled, a rare softness in his eyes. "You're already changing lives, Naomi, and this is just the start." One evening, the Justice Initiative hosted a celebration to honor its volunteers and supporters. The room buzzed with life. Community members swapped stories with legal professionals, their laughter mingling with the clink of glasses. Naomi stood at the center of it all, raising her glass to the crowd. "This isn't just my victory, it's ours," she said, her voice carrying over the din. "Every one of you has poured something into the sire time, your skills, your heart. Together, we've built a place where people are seen, heard, and lifted up. Let's not stop now." The room erupted in cheers, the energy crackling like a live wire. The next day, an unexpected visitor arrived, a young woman with hesitant steps and eyes that darted nervously around the room. She lingered near the entrance, clutching a worn notebook, as if unsure whether she belonged. Naomi noticed her immediately, crossing the space with a warm smile. "Welcome," she said gently, sensing the woman's unease. "What brought you here?" The woman hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "I heard about what you're doing, to need help. They're trying to take everything from me, and I don't know where else to turn." Naomi's expression softened, a fierce protectiveness flaring within her. "You're in the right place," she assured her, guiding her toward the office. "Let's sit down and figure this out together." Through it all, the lessons of justice and the consequences of power's misuse wove a thread of clarity. Emily's reign had been a cautionary to Leah stark reminder that authority unchecked could rot even the strongest foundations. Naomi, Odin, and Marcus had each tasted the bitterness of that betrayal, but they'd turned it into something greater. Naomi's fight was for the voiceless, a beacon against the darkness of prejudice. Odin's leadership was a promise to rebuild trust, brick by brick, proving that power could heal rather than harm. And Marcus, the steady hand guiding them, showed that true strength lay in accountability, not dominance. Together they were rewriting the story not just of an airport or a foundation, but of what it meant to stand for something bigger than themselves. The air felt thick with tension as Mrs. Williams stood trembling in the doorway, her arms wrapped protectively round the small bundle she cradled. The baby squirmed faintly, a soft whimper escaping its lips, as if sensing the storm of emotions swirling within its mother. Her eyes darted nervously round the room, taking in the modest office with its worn wooden desk and shelves stacked with files. She hadn't planned this visit, no appointment, no forethought, just a desperate need that had propelled her here. Her voice wavered as she spoke, barely above a whisper. "I don't have an appointment, but I had to see you." Naomi, seated behind the desk, looked up from her papers, her warm brown eyes softening at the sight of the woman's distress. With a gentle wave of her hand, she motioned toward the chair opposite her. "Of course, come in. Sit down. Tell me what's weighing on your heart." Mrs. Williams hesitated, her feet shuffling against the faded rug as she edged closer. The chair creaked under her slight frame as she sank into it, clutching her child tighter. Her words spilled out haltingly, each one laced with a raw, aching vulnerability. She described how she'd been let go from her job, a cashier position at a local grocery store, after months of subtle slights and unfair treatment, all because of the color of her skin. The memory of her supervisor's cold dismissal still burned in her chest, the way he'd avoided her gaze while muttering excuses about restructuring. Now, with no income and bills piling up like an avalanche, she could barely afford formula for her baby. Her voice cracked as she confessed her deepest fear, that her child would grow up in a world that refused to give them a fair chance. Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought to hold them back, her pride warring with her despair. Naomi listened, her posture steady, her face a mask of quiet compassion. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush to fill the silences with empty reassurances. Instead, she let Mrs. Williams pour out her story, every word sinking into her like stones into still water. When the woman finally fell silent, her breath ragged and her hands trembling, Naomi leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. Her voice was firm, carrying a strength that seemed to anchor the room. "You've come to the right place," she said, her gaze locking with Mrs. Williams. "We're going to help you. You're not facing this alone." For the first time, a fragile smile broke through the woman's tears, her shoulders sagging with relief. The tears she'd held back now streamed freely down her cheeks, glistening in the soft light filtering through the window. In that moment, Naomi felt a fire ignite within her, a renewed determination to push the justice initiative further, to turn the pain she saw in Mrs. Williams' eyes into a force for change. She could almost hear the echoes of her own struggles in the woman's story, and it fueled her resolve to offer not just aid, but hope. Meanwhile, miles away, the atmosphere at Greenview International Airport buzzed with a different kind of energy. The Grand Hall, once a chaotic tangle of hurried travelers and frayed tempers, had been transformed into a scene of jubilation. Vibrant banners stretched across the high ceilings, their bold letters proclaiming a new era for Greenview in shades of gold and green. Rows of chairs lined the polished floor, occupied by a diverse crowd. Airport staff in crisp uniforms, passengers clutching boarding passes, community leaders with eager smiles, and reporters scribbling notes. The air thrummed with anticipation, a collective holding of breath for a moment that felt like the turning of a page. At the center of it all stood Marcus, his broad shoulders squared as he stepped up to the podium. The microphone amplified his voice, sending it rolling through the terminal with a steady, commanding resonance. "Today," he began, his tone unwavering, "we close a chapter marked by turmoil and injustice, and we open one defined by unity and progress." He paused, his dark eyes sweeping over the sea of faces before him. Greenview had weathered storm scandals of corruption, protests over unfair treatment, moments when it seemed the airport might crumble under the weight of its own failures. But it had endured. Marcus felt the weight of that history in his bones, a mixture of pride and responsibility that steadied his hands as he gripped the podium. His gaze landed on Naomi, seated in the front row, her expression serene, yet radiating a quiet strength that bolstered his own. "This airport," he continued, "is no longer a battleground for division. It's a sanctuary where every person, regardless of where they come from, can feel safe, respected, and welcomed. That's the legacy we're crafting together." The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of sound that crashed against the walls and reverberated through the hall. Marcus stepped back, a subtle smile tugging at his lips as he gestured for Naomi to join him. She rose with a grace that belied the battles she'd fought, her steps deliberate as she crossed the stage. The crowd hushed, hanging on her presence. "Marcus and I have faced trials that could have shattered us," she began, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the stillness. "But those trials didn't break us, they forged us. They sharpened our will to stand up for what's right." Her eyes scanned the audience, lingering on familiar face, staff who'd stayed late to help, supporters who'd marched alongside them, friends who'd offered quiet encouragement in the darkest hours. To everyone who stood with us, who believed in us, who poured their hearts into making this day real, thank you. The applause swelled again, louder this time, with some rising to their feet in a spontaneous show of admiration. Naomi's smile widened, her voice steady as she added, "Greenview isn't just an airport anymore. It's a symbol of transformation, a lighthouse guiding us toward justice. Let's keep it shining." The ceremony flowed into the ribbon cutting for the newly renovated terminal, a gleaming space of glass and steel that stood as a testament to their perseverance. Marcus handed Naomi the oversized scissors, their polished blades catching the light. "Care to do the honors?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes warm with meaning. She nodded, her fingers curling around the handles with purpose. The snip was crisp, decisive, the red ribbon falling away as the crowd cheered. "To new beginnings," she declared, her words carrying a weight that settled over everyone like a promise. Later, as the noise of the celebration faded, Marcus and Naomi wandered through the terminal together. The once dingy corridors now sparkled with fresh paint and bright mural scenes of people, from all walks of life, united in vibrant color. Passengers moved with a relaxed ease, and staff walked taller, their faces lit with a pride that had been absent for too long. "This feels different," Naomi murmured, her eyes tracing the changes. "It is different," Marcus replied, his voice low but certain, "because we made it that way." Their walk was interrupted by a young baggage handler, his uniform slightly rumpled from a long shift. He approached hesitantly, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams," he said, his voice soft but earnest, "I just wanted to say thank you. I've been here 3 years, and this is the first time I've felt proud to work at Greenview." His eyes, wide and sincere, held a flicker of gratitude that touched Naomi deeply. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "Keep that pride alive," she told him. "This place needs people like you to carry the change forward." He nodded, a shy smile breaking across his face before he hurried back to his post, his steps a little lighter. As the day drew to a close, a smaller gathering unfolded in a conference room overlooking the runway. Close friends, loyal staff, and steadfast supporters mingled, their laughter and stories filling the space. Odin, a weary man with sharp features and a perpetually observant gaze, stood near the window, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky bled orange and pink. Marcus joined him, a glass of water in hand. "You've done well," Odin said, his voice gruff but tinged with approval. "So have you," Marcus replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "Greenview's future is secure with you as deputy director." Odin's lips twitched into a faint smirk. "Don't think this means you can slack off. There's always more to do." Marcus chuckled, nodding. "Always, but for once, I feel like we're moving toward something good." Outside, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus and Naomi stood together, watching planes climb into the twilight. The hum of engines vibrated through the air, a steady rhythm that felt almost comforting after so much upheaval. Naomi slipped her hand into Marcus's, their fingers intertwining naturally. "We've come so far," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of their shared journey. "And we're just getting started," he replied, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. They stood in silence, the past stretching behind them like a long, winding road marked by pain, yes, but also by victories that had reshaped their world. As a plane soared overhead, Naomi's eyes flickered with hope. "For all the fights we've won," she murmured, "and the ones still ahead." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady on the horizon. "For everything we're building." Across the city, dawn broke over the morning streets, casting a golden glow on Jamal Carter as he moved with quiet purpose. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his modest jacket, his neatly pressed shirt a subtle contrast to the casual bustle around him. The city hummed with its usual chaos cars honking, footsteps clattering, snippets of conversation drifting past, but Jamal's focus was razor-sharp. Today was his first day as head of the Public Safety Department, a role that made him both the youngest and the only black person to hold the position. Pride swelled in his chest, tempered by a calm determination to prove himself. He'd spent months preparing, sketching out plans to mend the frayed trust between law enforcement and the community. Each step he took felt like a promissetto himself, to his family, to the people he'd sworn to serve. He was a block from the department building when a rough voice cut through his thoughts. "Hey, you there?" Jamal turned, his stride faltering as a uniformed officer approached. The man was tall and broad, his graying hair and rigid stance giving him an air of weathered authority. His badge gleamed in the morning light, identifying him as Sergeant Williams. His eyes, cold and scrutinizing, raked over Jamal with undisguised suspicion. "What are you doing around here?" he demanded, his tone thick with accusation. Jamal straightened, meeting the officer's gaze with a steady calm, though a flicker of wariness stirred in his gut. "I'm on my way to the Public Safety Department," he answered evenly. Williams smirked, the disbelief plain on his face. "Is that so? And what's your business there?" His voice dripped with hostility, each word a challenge. "I work there," Jamal replied, his patience thinning, but his composure intact. Williams barked a harsh laugh, stepping closer until his shadow loomed over Jamal. "You work there, doing what, exactly?" Before Jamal could respond, the officer's face hardened, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "Let's cut the nonsense. I don't know what you think you're pulling in this neighborhood, but people like you don't just stroll around here for no reason. Empty your pockets." The command hung heavy in the air, drawing the attention of a few passersby who slowed their steps, their curious glances prickling Jamal's skin. He took a slow breath, his mind racing as he weighed his options. The irony wasn't lost on him or he was on the cusp of leading change, only to be confronted by the very injustice he aimed to dismantle. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Officer, I don't believe this is necessary." In these moments, William's quiet desperation, Marcus and Naomi's hard-won triumph, Jamal's tense standoff lay a profound lesson. Justice isn't a gift bestowed from on high, it's a flame nurtured through courage and persistence. Power, when wielded carelessly, can crush the vulnerable as Mrs. Williams knew too well, or divide a community, as Greenview once suffered. Yet when those who hold it are held accountable, when they're challenged by voices like Naomi's, Marcus's, and Jamal's, it can be reshaped into something greater. Their stories weave a tapestry of resilience, a reminder that the consequences of abuse ripple far beyond the moment. but so too does the strength to stand against it. Together, they built not just a better airport or a safer city, but a legacy of hopion that demands we all ask how we, too, can rise to meet the call of fairness and unity. The morning sun beat down on the cracked pavement as Jamal strode purposefully toward the Public Safety Department building, his polished shoes clicking against the ground with each determined step. Beneath his composed exterior, a storm of frustration churned. His jaw tightened as he replayed the encounter that had just unfolded, the bitter taste of indignation lingering on his tongue. Sergeant Williams, a burly man with a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face, had stopped him mere blocks ago, his voice dripping with condescension as he demanded to know Jamal's business. Though Jamal's tone remained even, his insides roiled with a fury he fought to contain, a fire stoked by the sheer audacity of the man before him. Williams stood there, chest puffed out like a rooster claiming its territory, his arms crossed over his faded uniform. "What I think is necessary isn't up to you," he'd snapped, his eyes narrowing as if daring Jamal to argue. "You think you can just ignore a direct order?" The words hung heavy in the air, sharp and accusatory. Jamal felt his chest constrict, a tight knot of outrage forming as he registered the blatant disrespect. He wanted to lash out, to let the anger spill over and drown Williams in its intensity. But years of navigating such encounters had taught him restraint. Instead, he inhaled deeply, the breath a lifeline to his composure, and moved with slow, deliberate precision. His hands dipped into his pockets, retrieving his wallet, his phone, and a small, worn notebook where he scribbled fleeting thoughts, an Idisa ritual that grounded him. Williams snatched the items with a sneer, his thick fingers flipping through the wallet with exaggerated care. He held it up to the light, inspecting it as though he expected to uncover some hidden evidence of wrongdoing, his disdain palpable. Jamal stood motionless, acutely aware of the growing cluster of onlookers nearby. A young woman with a stroller paused, her brow furrowing as she watched the scene unfold. Two teenage boys lingered on the corner, their phones already raised, capturing every humiliating second. The weight of their stares pressed against Jamal's skin, a fresh wave of shame surging through him. His neck burned, the heat creeping upward as he fought to keep his expression neutral, his dignity intact. After a thorough rummaging that yielded nothing of interest, Williams tossed the wallet back with a grunt. "What did I tell you?" he said, his voice low and mocking. "There's a time and place for everyone, and this ain't your place." The words were a slap, meant to diminish, to remind Jamal of some unspoken hierarchy. But Jamal refused to buckle. He lifted his chin, his dark eyes locking onto Williams's with quiet defiance, even as the sting of humiliation gnawed at him. "You've got your answers, Sergeant," he replied, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of steel. He bent to gather his belongings, each movement deliberate, a silent reclaiming of his agency. "If you'll excuse me, I have a job to get to." Williams raised a bushy eyebrow, amusement flickering across his face as if Jamal's resolve were some private joke. "A job in the Public Safety Department." He let out a dry, humorless chuckle that grated against Jamal's ears. "Well, if by some miracle you actually belong there, maybe I'll see you round." He stepped back, arms folding again, watching with smug satisfaction as Jamal turned to leave. The small crowd lingered, their whispers a dull hum in the background, some curious, some judgmental, all feeding the knot of resentment in Jamal's gut. He could feel their eyes boring into his back as he walked away, the teenagers still filming, the woman with the stroller shaking her head in quiet disapproval. With each step toward the department building, Jamal forced himself to breathe, the air a balm against the rawness of the encounter. The anger simmered, intertwined with a deep, aching bitterness at having to swallow his pride, to stay silent in the face of such flagrant arrogance. But as the sleek glass facade of the building came into view, he steeled himself. This wasn't just about him, it was bigger than one degrading moment. It was about the system, the ingrained biases that men like Williams wielded without remorse, and the work Jamal had committed to undoing them. The humiliation only sharpened his resolve, a reminder of why he'd fought so hard to reach this point. At the entrance, he paused before the reflective doors, catching a glimpse of himself, tall, broad-shouldered, his suit crisp despite the morning's ordeal. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his features into a mask of calm, and pushed forward. But just as his hand grazed the handle, Williams's voice sliced through the air again, sharp and taunting. "Guess we're both headed to the same place." The sergeant's bark of laughter followed, rich with mockery, as he trailed a short distance behind. He clearly assumed Jamal was some low-level staffer and assistant, perhaps, or a consultant at best, someone insignificant, easily dismissed. Jamal didn't dignify it with a response. He stepped inside, his stride quickening as he was ushered toward the administrative wing, leaving Williams's smugness to echo in the lobby. The office they led him to was expansive, its wide windows framing a sprawling view of the city skyline, a testament to how far he'd climbed, and the weight of the responsibility now resting on his shoulders. Jamal settled into the leather chair behind his desk, the nameplate glinting in the morning light. Chief Jamal Carter, Head of Public Safety. The title felt both like a triumph and a challenge, a beacon of what he intended to achieve. He'd barely had time to unpack his thoughts when a sharp knock interrupted the silence. "Come in," he called, his voice smooth but his gaze keen, ready for whatever awaited. The door swung open, and there stood Williams, his broad frame filling the threshold. His lips curled into a smirk, as if he carried some delicious secret. But the moment his eyes landed on the nameplate, the expression evaporated. His face went slack, the color draining from his ruddy cheeks as realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. His mouth parted slightly, a choked sound escaping as he stared at Jamal, the same man he'd belittled minutes ago, now seated in authority over him. Jamal let the silence stretch, watching as Williams's bravado crumbled, his shoulders stiffening with the dawning horror of his misstep. "Sergeant Williams," Jamal said at last, leaning forward slightly, his tone measured but edged with an unyielding resolve. "Please have a seat." Williams stumbled forward, his usual swagger replaced by a clumsy shuffle. "I didn't realize," he began, his voice cracking, but Jamal raised a hand, cutting him off. "We'll get to that. For now, let's talk about what respect and professionalism mean in this department." Williams sank into the chair, his bulk seeming to shrink as the weight of his actions settled over him. His jaw clenched, a flicker of resentment sparking in his eyes, but it was overshadowed by the stark vulnerability of a man stripped bare. Jamal leaned back, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos roiling within Williams. "I got a first-hand look at how you handle the public out there," he continued, his voice steady as a blade. "The way you wield your authority, the assumptions you make. It's not new behavior, is it?" Williams shifted, his gaze dropping to the floor, unable to meet the piercing intensity of Jamal's stare. His pride was a battered thing now, wrestling with the urge to defend himself, to reclaim some shred of dignity. "I didn't know you were my superior," he muttered, the words bitter and grudging. "And that makes it acceptable?" Jamal's question was a quiet thunderclap, reverberating through the room. "It's fine to treat someone that way if they're not in this building." Williams's lips pressed into a thin line, his resentment simmering beneath the surface. But he managed a strained "No, sir," through gritted teeth. Jamal studied him, letting the tension hang heavy between them. "You see, Sergeant, that's precisely why I'm here. This isn't about rank, it's about the people we're sworn to protect. No one should be degraded on the street because they don't match your preconceptions." He paused, letting the words sink into Williams's thick skull. "If I weren't who I am, what do you think would have happened out there?" Another complaint buried, another person silenced. Williams swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as his face hardened. But he offered no answer. Inside, a war-ravaged his ego clawing against the shame that threatened to engulf him. Jamal pressed on, his voice unwavering. "This department is under new leadership now, and with it comes change. We serve this community, you don't intimidate it. Your actions today, they undermine everything we stand for, and they won't happen again." Williams's eyes flickered with something akin to panic. He wasn't accustomed to being called out, especially not by someone younger, someone he'd dismissed so easily. "I understand, sir," he mumbled, the words barely audible, forced out through a haze of discomfort. But Jamal wasn't finished. "We're launching a new training initiative," he said, his tone firm and deliberate. "It's designed to root out bias and build respect between officers and the public. You'll be the first to go through it, Sergeant." Williams's head snapped up, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't need." Jamal cut him off, his voice cool and commanding. "Did I ask if you needed it? You'll complete every session, every module. You'll participate fully. This isn't optional." Williams's fists clenched in his lap, his knuckles whitening as the humiliation sank deeper. Being singled out, forced into training, because of his own arrogant sight was a blow he could scarcely endure. His jaw tightened, his anger a coiled snake ready to strike, but he knew he was cornered. "Understood, sir," he forced out, his voice a strangled whisper. Jamal nodded, satisfied. "Dismissed, Sergeant. I'll be watching your progress closely." Williams rose stiffly, his face flushed with a mix of rage and mortification, and shuffled out of the office without another word. The door clicked shut, and Jamal exhaled, a quiet resolve settling over him. The morning had been a trial by fire, but it had laid the groundwork for the transformation he intended to bring. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability, about dismantling the abuse of power that men like Williams had grown to comfortable wielding. As he sat back, Jamal's mind drifted to the street, to the faces in the crowd, the woman's quiet sympathy, the teenager's detached curiosity. He thought of how it felt to be reduced, to be judged without cause, and the memory fueled his purpose. No one else would endure that under his watch. By the next day, whispers of Williams's mandated training had rippled through the department. In the break room, a pair of officers exchanged smirks as Williams stormed in, his face a mask of barely contained fury. He felt their eyes, heard the low murmur of their amusement, and the sting of his fall from grace burned hotter. For Jamal, it was a start, a lesson in consequences, a step toward a deeper justice that reached beyond one man's shame to the heart of a flawed system. The air in the precinct felt heavy that day, thick with unspoken tension as Sergeant Williams strode through the bullpen. He could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the way eyes darted toward him and then quickly away, as though he were a storm cloud no one wanted to acknowledge. He'd heard the whispers, caught the faint snickers that trailed in his wake, and it gnawed at him like a splinter lodged deep to pull out. His chest tightened with every step, the weight of his tarnished reputation pressing harder against his ribs. For years, he'd walked these halls with his head high, his authority unquestioned, but now, it felt as though the ground beneath him was crumbling. One of the younger officers, Matthews, lounged against a desk, his posture casual but his eyes glinting with mischief. He didn't even try to mask the smirk tugging at his lips as he glanced over at Williams. "Heard you're the first one tapped for the chief's shiny new training program," Matthews drawled, his voice dripping with amusement, each syllable a deliberate jab. He crossed his arms, leaning back as if he were settling in to watch a show. "Guess some folks need a little extra help seeing the bigger picture, huh?" Williams stopped dead in his tracks, his dark eyes narrowing as they locked onto Matthews. The younger officer's grin only widened, a silent dare hanging between them. "Watch yourself, Matthews," Williams growled, his voice low and edged with warning. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles whitening as he fought to keep his temper in check. Matthews just shrugged, a soft chuckle escaping him as he turned away, muttering under his breath, "Extra perspective's a hell of a thing." The words lingered in the air like smoke, curling around Williams and stoking the fire already burning in his gut. His face flushed a deep crimson, the heat creeping up his neck as he stood there, rooted to the spot. He could feel a slow, agonizing unraveling of everything he'd built. Decades of commanding respect, of being the man others looked to in a crisis, all slipping away in a matter of hours. Being forced into this training program wasn't just a reassignment, it was a public shaming, a scarlet letter branded across his chest for all to see. The humiliation sank into him, sharp and relentless, eating away at the armor he'd worn so proudly for so long. Later that evening, after the shift had ended, Williams found himself alone in the department's training room. The space was stark and lifeless, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, casting a cold, unforgiving glow across the linoleum floor. The walls were plastered with posters, bold words like accountability and community trust screaming out in block letters, their bright colors clashing against the sterile white backdrop. To Williams, they weren't reminders of duty, they were accusations. each one pointing a finger squarely at him. He slumped into a chair at the back of the room, the metal creaking under his weight, and let his gaze drift aimlessly. His mind churned, replaying the moment that had landed him Harasses meeting with Chief Jamal Carter. He could still see Jamal sitting behind that polished desk, his posture calm and composed, his dark eyes steady and unyielding. Williams had stood there, fists balled at his sides, his pride warring with the sting of being summoned like some rookie caught breaking protocol. He'd wanted to yell, to demand that Jamal acknowledge the years he'd poured into this department, the blood and sweat that had earned him his stripes. But Jamal hadn't flinched, hadn't given him an inch to wield his seniority like a shield. Instead, the chief had delivered the news with a quiet authority that left Williams reeling. He was to attend the training program, effective immediately. The memory looped in his head, each replay tightening the knot of anger and shame twisting inside him. When the training session finally began, Williams sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched so tight it sent a dull ache radiating through his skull. The instructor, a black woman roughly his age, stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding despite the softness in her voice. She was an outsider, brought in by Jamal to shake things up, and her sharp gaze seemed to pierce right through him. She spoke candidly about her own life, about the prejudice she'd faced, the barriers she'd overcome, and wove those stories into a broader lesson about accountability. Her words were measured, but heavy, landing like stones in the pit of Williams's stomach. He tried to tune her out, to cling to the certainty that he didn't belong here. But her eyes kept finding his, unflinching and knowing. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind, an unwelcome guest he couldn't quite shake. What if he wasn't as untouchable as he'd always believed? When the session ended, Williams stumbled out of the room, his pride shredded and his spirit raw. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, the chatter of his colleagues echoing faintly in the distance. He kept his head down, unable to meet their eyes, the weight of his shame pressing against his shoulders like a physical burden. Jamal's voice echoed in his ears, "It's an opportunity, Sergeant," but all Williams could feel was the bitter sting of disgrace. For the first time in years, he felt himself coming apart at the seams, the training program peeling back layers he'd buried beneath a weight of unshakable confidence. Each session that followed chipped away at him further. The instructors posed questions that lingered in the air, sharp and probing, forcing him to confront truths he'd long ignored. He tried to dismiss them, to retreat behind the wall of bravado that had served him so well, but the cracks were spreading. Then, one crisp morning, he found himself summoned to Jamal's office once more. The chief's expression was a blank slate, a calm mask that unsettled Williams more than any reprimand ever could. "Sergeant, sit down," Jamal said, his voice steady as he gestured to the chair across from his desk. Williams obeyed, his movements stiff, his spine rigid with tension. He wasn't sure he'd ever adjust to the staking orders from a man half his age, a man who'd seen him at his lowest. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, until Jamal finally spoke. "I've reviewed the initial feedback from your training sessions." Williams swallowed hard, nodding faintly, his throat dry as he struggled to maintain a weight of composure. Anxiety churned in his gut, a restless storm he couldn't quell. "It seems you're struggling to engage with the material," Jamal continued, his tone even but firm. "Several instructors noted resistance on your part." The words hit Williams like a slap, igniting a flare of wounded pride. "With all due respect, Chief Carter," he said, his voice tight, "I don't think I'm the one who needs this training most. I've served this community for decades. I know these streets, these people. I'm not the problem here." Jamal's eyes sharpened, cutting through Williams's defiance like a blade. "That's exactly the mindset we're trying to change, Sergeant. No one's above accountability, and even you." Williams's jaw locked, and he dropped his gaze, unable to withstand the intensity of Jamal's stare. The office walls seemed to close in, the air growing stifling as his defenses crumbled. Jamal leaned forward, his voice dropping to a quieter, more piercing register. "You think your experience excuses you from reflection. You've operated with impunity for too long. But here's the thing, you know more about your past than you realize." Williams's head jerked up, alarm flashing across his face like a lightning strike. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice cracking despite his efforts to steady it. Jamal studied him, his gaze a spotlight that pinned Williams in place, exposing every flicker of unease. "I've reviewed your records," Jamal said slowly, each word deliberate, "and I came across something unusual." Williams's mouth went dry, his heart pounding against his ribcage. He'd been so careful, so certain that his past was a vault sealed shut forever. "When you were younger," Jamal went on, "there was an incident, a report of disorderly conduct, allegations of assault, but instead of facing consequences, it seems your record was wiped clean." The room tilted around Williams, his throat constricting as though an invisible hand had clamped around it. He'd buried that chapter of his life decades ago, scrubbed it from existence with meticulous care. He'd built himself into a pillar of the department, a man who upheld the law, not one who bent it. But now, the truth loomed before him, a shadow he couldn't outrun. "That was years ago," he managed, his voice trembling despite his resolve. "It's got nothing to do with how I serve now." Jamal's expression hardened, his voice taking on a colder edge. "Doesn't it? You may have kept it hidden, but your attitude or sense of entitlement has always shone through. The way you treated me on the street wasn't a one-off, and I've got reason to believe it's part of a pattern." Williams felt his grip on the conversation slipping, his pride buckling under the weight of Jamal's words. "Chief Carter," he faltered, the words dying in his throat. How could he justify something he'd spent a lifetime burying? Jamal's gaze softened just a fraction, a hint of something gentler breaking through the steel. "Sergeant, we've all made mistakes. The question is, are you willing to face yours?" Williams's face burned with a volatile mix of anger and shame. He wanted to storm out, to tell Jamal he had no right to dredge up the past and wield it like a weapon. But deep down, a small, nagging voice whispered that Jamal was right. The humiliation, the tension, the unraveling it all pointed to a truth he'd dodged for years. He'd never truly been held to account. "Why are you doing this?" Williams finally asked, his voice raw with frustration and a flicker of genuine bewilderment. Jamal's expression eased, a glimmer of empathy shining through. "Because I want to build a department that reflects the best of this community, Williams. And I believe even someone like you could be part of that if you're willing to put in the work." The words settled over Williams like a heavy blanket, both a challenge and a lifeline. For a fleeting moment, he let himself imagine shedding the anger that had defined him, releasing the resentment that had festered for so long. But then his defenses surged back, fierce and unyielding. "You think a few training sessions will rewrite decades of how this department runs? You think the community wants us weak?" Jamal shook his head, unfazed. "Respect isn't weakness, Williams. The community wants a department that protects and serves everyone fairly. You could help make that happen, or you can stay stuck, watching the world move on without you." The finality in Jamal's tone rang like a bell, a quiet warning that Williams's days of coasting on unchecked power were over. Every instinct screamed at him to push back, to cling to the man he'd been. But a part of him felt exposed, stripped bare, and vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. After a long, heavy pause, Williams managed a faint nod, his eyes barely lifting to meet Jamal's. "Understood, Chief," he muttered, the words tasting like ash. Jamal watched him, calm but expectant. "Good, because next week, you'll be presenting to the department about your experiences in this program. I expect nothing less than complete honesty, Sergeant." Williams's stomach dropped, his face paling at the thought of standing before his peers, laying bare his flaws for all to see. But Jamal's gaze held steady, offering no escape. "Yes, sir," Williams whispered, the last shard of his pride slipping through his fingers like sand. As he left the office, the weight of justice and consequence settled over him, a lesson carved deep into his bones. Power, unchecked, had a pricing for Williams. That reckoning had finally come. As he slipped out of the office that evening, Williams stood motionless for a moment, the cool air of the hallway brushing against his skin. It felt as though he were shedding an old version of himself, leaving behind a man he barely recognized. The burden of his choices clung to him like a second skin, heavy and unyielding, pressing down with every step he took toward the exit. Jamal's gaze lingered in his Minda quiet, unshakable presence that rattled him to his core. It wasn't just the authority in those eyes that unsettled him deep down, beneath the discomfort. There was something about Jamal's stillness that sparked a flicker of awe, a reluctant admiration William couldn't quite shake. The week that followed was a blur of restless days and sleepless nights. William dragged himself out of bed each morning, his body heavy with dread, and forced himself into the training sessions he'd once scoffed at. The room was sterile and stark, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the rows of chairs. Each session felt like a chisel chipping away at the foundation of beliefs he'd built over decades, beliefs he'd worn like armor, convinced they made him strong, wise, untouchable. Now they were crumbling, and with every layer that fell away, he felt more exposed, more uncertain. The trainer's voice droned on, calm but insistent, dissecting his habits with surgical precision. William's jaw tightened as he listened, his mind warring between resistance and reluctant understanding. But the real weight, the one that kept him awake, staring at the ceiling in the dead of night, was the presentation looming on the horizon. Standing before his colleagues, men and women who'd seen him as a rock, a veteran forged by years on the beat, and admitting his failures, it wasn't just daunting, it was a reckoning, a punishment sharper and more personal than any reprimand he'd ever faced. The night before the presentation, William sat hunched over his kitchen table, a single bulb flickering faintly overhead. The cramped space smelled faintly of stale coffee and regret, its peeling walls closing in around him. Scattered across the table were crumpled sheets of paper, scribbled notes that blurred into nonsense the longer he stared at them. His hands shook as he tried to piece together something coherent, some way to explain himself, to justify the man he'd been. But every word felt hollow, every sentence a lie. How could he face his peers, people who'd trusted him, looked to him for guidance, and confess that he'd been wrong, that he'd let prejudice guide his badge? Shame coiled tight in his chest, suffocating him, squeezing until he could barely breathe. For a fleeting moment, he imagined skipping it altogether, walking away, letting the silence swallow his mistakes. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew he couldn't, not anymore. Morning arrived, gray and uninviting, mirroring the hollowness that had settled into his bones. William stepped into the department, his boots echoing against the polished floor, and felt the air shift around him. Whispers followed in his wake, soft but cutting, like the rustle of leaves before a storm. Officers darted sidelong glances his way, some curious, others tinged with suspicion. He could sense it. They knew about the training, the special sessions he'd been singled out for. Their judgment hung thick in the air, unspoken but suffocating, wrapping around him like a noose. He kept his head down, his shoulders squared, but inside, he was unraveling. The briefing room was larger than he'd remembered, its high ceiling and rows of chairs stretching out like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. Officers trickled in, their boots scuffing the floor, some slumping into seats with bored expressions, others watching him with keen interest. William stood at the podium, his palms slick against the wood, his heart hammering so loud he was sure they could hear it. Jamal entered last, slipping into a chair at the back, his presence a quiet anchor amid the restless sea of faces. His expression was unreadable, attentive, and it steadied William just enough to begin. "I've been with this department for nearly 30 years, he said, his voice rough like gravel. But it held. He gripped the podium tighter, willing his hands to stop trembling. "I've watched this city shift and grow, seen officers rise and fall, and I've always thought of myself as someone who had it figured out, someone who could keep the chaos in check." He paused, his eyes flicking to Jamal, who offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough to push him forward. "But these last few weeks, these training sessions, they've forced me to face something I didn't want to see." His throat tightened, each word dragging a piece of him into the open. "I've had to look hard at how I've acted, how I've let my own beliefs, my own mistakes hurt the people I swore to protect." The room stirred. A few officers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging quick, uneasy glances. William pressed on, the shame rising like bile, but he refused to stop. "Last week, I stopped a young man on the street. Black kid, plain clothes. Nothing about him that screamed trouble. But in my head, I'd already made up my mind. I saw him as a threat, someone who didn't belong, and I treated him like he was less than human." His voice broke, a raw edge slicing through the stillness, and he dropped his gaze, heat flooding his face. The silence in the room was deafening, pressing against his ears. When he looked up, he saw shock etched into some faces, disbelief in others, and was that pity? But Jamal's steady watchfulness held him together, a lifeline in the storm of his own making. I told myself I was doing my job, he continued, forcing the words out through gritted teeth. But the truth is, I was leaning on my own biases, my own warped ideas of what's right. And I can't hide from that anymore. A younger officer, Daniels, shot up his hand, his face a storm of frustration and something sharper betrayal, maybe. "Sergeant, why now?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Why spill this after all these years?" William met his eyes, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Because, Daniels, if we don't own up to what we've done wrong, nothing gets better. I've spent my whole career thinking I was above being questioned. I was wrong. And I'm saying it now because I owe it to you, to everyone here, and to the people out there to start making it right." The room fell into a thick, heavy silence, the kind that settles into your bones. William felt the sting of shame crawl up his spine, the bitter taste of failure coating his tongue. He'd let them down, his team, the community, himself. As he stepped back, Jamal rose, his movements deliberate, and made his way to the front. He gave William a single note, a silent handoff before turning to the room. "Sergeant Williams took a hard step today," Jamal said, his voice low but resonant, filling the space with quiet power. "He's shown us that real change doesn't come from outside, it starts right here, inside each of us. Accountability isn't just something we demand from others, it's what we demand of ourselves. We're here to protect, but we're also here to grow, to question what we've always assumed." His gaze swept over the officers, sharp and unflinching. "This department won't stand for prejudice dressed up as duty anymore. We serve everyone, and that means seeing everyone, really seeing them without the filters we've clung to. Thank you, Sergeant, for laying it bare." He nodded at William again, then addressed the room once more. "I expect every one of you to hold yourselves to that same line. If we want trust from the people out there, we've got to earn it. That starts today, with every choice we make." The weight of Jamal's words lingered as officers processed them in silence. Some nodded slowly, the truth sinking in. Others stared at the floor, wrestling with their own unease. When the meeting ended, Jamal approached William, resting a hand on his shoulder. "That wasn't easy," he said, his voice softening, almost kind. "But it was the right call." William managed a tight nod, words failing him. Relief washed over him, mingling with exhaustion, and for the first time in years, he felt lighter, like he'd finally loosened the grip of something he'd carried too long. In the days that followed, the department buzzed with subtle changes. Officers who'd once slapped William on the back with easy camaraderie now approached him with a cautious respect, their eyes searching his for something new. A few pulled him aside in quiet corners, their voices low, confessing their own struggles with bias, their own moments of doubt. "I didn't think I'd hear it from you," one said, a rookie with wide, earnest eyes. "But it made me think twice." William listened, nodded, and felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, purpose, maybe, or redemption. Jamal's training sessions took on a new meaning for him. What had once felt like a sentence now seemed like a life-linear chance to dismantle the man he'd been and build something better. He sat through every grueling hour, absorbing the stories, the lessons, letting them reshape him. And Jamal, he didn't gloat or linger on William's confession. He treated him like any other officer, his quiet insistence on equality weaving its way into the department's fabric. Months later, the ripples of that day were undeniable. Officers who'd rolled their eyes at trust-building exercises now saw the payoff. Fewer clenched fists on the streets, more conversations that didn't end in shouts. The city felt it to a slow, tentative shift in the air. William had finished the program by then, emerging raw and changed, his pride battered, but his resolve stronger. One afternoon, Jamal found him in the break room, surrounded by a cluster of rookies hanging on his every word. "You don't get it right every time," William was saying, his voice steady. "But you've got to keep asking yourself why you're doing this while you're really serving." Jamal paused in the doorway, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and for a moment, William caught his eye in that look. He saw not just approval, but a challenge to keep going, to never stop learning. And for the first time, William felt ready to meet it. The room buzzed with anticipation as men and women leaned forward in their seats, their eyes fixed on William's. His broad shoulders slumped slightly, a posture that felt foreign to him, as he spoke with a humility that caught everyone off guard. His voice, rough like gravel yet laced with an unfamiliar openness, carried through the air. "I used to think my job was all about keeping folks in check," he began, his gaze drifting downward as if searching the floor for the man he once was. "I figured I had to be the loudest, the toughest, the one who owned every room I walked into. My badge, that was my crown, and I thought it was enough to make people bow to me." He paused, shaking his head slowly, the faintest flicker of a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Turns out, I was just hiding from the fact that respect doesn't come from a piece of metal pinned to your chest. It comes from how you treat people, from giving them what you expect in return." From the edge of the room, Jamal stood with his arms crossed, watching Williams unravel his story. A swell of pride mingled with relief churned in his chest, warming him from the inside out. Williams had been his Everest, a towering, unyielding wall of resistance. His gruff voice once the loudest in every argument against Jamal's push for change. Yet here he was, his tone softer, his words deliberate, passing on lessons Jamal had fought tooth and nail to instill. It wasn't a grand triumph, not the kind that came with banners or applause, but a quiet, fragile victory that rooted itself deep in Jamal's heart. He could feel a shift, a ripple of something real taking hold, proof that the ideals he'd clung to weren't just dreams, but seeds finally breaking through stone. As the crowd of rookies thinned out, their footsteps echoing faintly down the hall, Williams caught sight of Jamal. He straightened, his heavy boots scuffing the linoleum as he closed the distance between them. His face, weathered by years of stern scowls, seemed different now, less guarded, the hard edges softened by something Jamal couldn't quite name. "Chief," Williams said, dipping his head in a nod that felt almost reverent. "Never thought I'd be standing here saying this, but thank you for pushing me. I mean," his voice faltered for a split second, betraying the weight of those words. Jamal met his gaze, a faint smile breaking through his usual calm. "I didn't do it for thanks, Williams," he replied, his tone steady but warm. "I did it because I saw something in you, something worth believing in. Even when you couldn't see it yourself." Williams let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting around the bustling precinctificers shuffling papers. Phones ringing faintly in the background bore settling back on Jamal. "You know, I was sure I'd hate you forever for dragging me through all that," he admitted, his voice low, almost confessional. "But I get it now, and I'm damn glad you didn't let me off the hook." They stood there, the silence stretching between them, heavy with the ghosts of old grudges and unspoken battles. For Jamal, it was like a storm finally clearing their lighter, the tension that had once crackled between them dissolving into something solid, something true. In Williams's eyes, he saw it too, a sincerity that cut through the bravado, a humility neither of them had anticipated. It was a bridge built from broken pieces, a shared understanding that their past didn't have to define their future. Together, they'd turned a corner, not just for themselves but for the department they both served. Weeks later, the sharp scent of coffee and the hum of restless voices filled a community center in one of the city's roughest corners. Jamal had poured his soul into organizing this meeting, a desperate bid to stitch together the fraying trust between the department and the people it swore to protect. Rows of folding chairs creaked under the weight of dozens of residents, some curious, others skeptical, their faces a mosaic of hope and hard-earned caution. As the meeting kicked off, Williams stepped forward, volunteering to stand at Jamal's side. His hands fidgeted at his sides, betraying a nervousness he tried to mask with a squared jaw and a stiff stance. The crowd stirred, whispers rippling through the room as a few recognized him, his broad frame, his piercing stare from encounters they'd rather forget. Jamal raised a hand, his voice cutting through the murmurs with a quiet strength. "We're here to listen," he said, his eyes sweeping the room, locking onto every pair that dared meet his. "I know some of you have walked away from this department feeling invisible, or worse, wronged. Tonight, we're here to start fixing that. The words hung in the air, a promise wrapped in resolve. Then, an older woman with silver hair and a spine of steel raised her hand. Her gaze boring into Williams. "Sergeant," she said, her voice trembling with memory. "I remember you. Patrolling our streets like you owned them. You looked at my grandson standing on his own porch. Mind you, like he was some criminal. Made him feel small in his own home." Williams swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical force. His throat tightened, but he forced his voice to hold steady. "Ma'am," he said, meeting her eyes, "I'm sorry. I know those words don't undo what I did. Don't erase the hurt I caused your family. But I was wrong, blind to it back then. I've been through the training we're rolling out here, and it's opened my eyes. I'm standing here tonight because I'm done being that man. I want to make damn sure no one else feels what your grandson did because of me." His voice cracked slightly, raw and unguarded, and the room fell silent, the echo of his apology lingering like a held breath. Jamal watched, his heart lifting as he saw the woman's stern features soften, the lines of mistrust easing into something tentative, almost forgiving. One by one, others stood with clenched fists recounting late-night stops, mothers with tired eyes sharing stories of fear for their sons. Jamal and Williams listened, absorbing every word, every shard of pain. By the time the last voice faded, the chasm between the badges and the neighborhood felt less like an abyss and more like a gap that could be crossed. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Distrust still lingered in the corners, but it was a beginning, a fragile thread of hope woven from accountability and grit. In the days that followed, the precinct hummed with a new energy. Officers who'd once scoffed at Jamal's training now stepped forward, inspired by Williams's raw honesty and the echoes of that night. Williams himself took on a new role, his gruff voice now guiding younger cops with hard-won wisdom. "Lead with respect," he'd tell them, his eyes narrowing as he recalled his own stumbles. "Authority's nothing if it's just a fist slamming down." Jamal watched this shift with quiet pride, knowing the real work was just beginning. Then came the letter, a crisp envelope from the mayor's office, its contents spilling out a future Jamal hadn't dared imagine. His training program, born from sleepless nights and relentless faith, was set to spread citywide, with a commendation ceremony to honor his efforts. At the event, he stood tall under the glare of lights, facing a sea of uniforms, suits, and familiar faces from the community. "This isn't about me or one department," he said, his voice ringing clear. "It's about all of U.S. cops, citizens, very own building a city that's safer, fairer. I'm accepting this for every single person who believed in change when it felt impossible." As he stepped down, his eyes found Williams in the crowd, clapping with a pride that mirrored Jamal's own. A nod passed between them, a silent vow to keep going. Months later, the department was a living thing, evolving under their unlikely partnership. Williams, still blunt and no nonsense, had softened in ways that surprised even himself, becoming a tether between Jamal's vision and the old guard who resisted it. His presence carried a new weight, respect earned, not demanded. Jamal's program rippled outward, a beacon for reform that stretched beyond their city's borders. Challenges loomed, inevitable and daunting, but Jamal faced them with a steady confidence, bolstered by allies who shared his fire. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Jamal stood at his office window, the city sprawling before him like a map of their struggles and triumphs. The journey had reshaped him as much as it had Williams teaching him that leadership wasn't just about strength, but about patience, about pushing through the fog when the way forward blurred. Fulfillment settled over him, deep and unshakable. The road stretched on, endless and uncertain. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Williams, the community, the officers who'd dared to believe. Together, they were crafting something, enduring something that spoke to justice, to the cost of power misused, and to the quiet power of redemption. For Jamal, that was more than enough, was everything. Meanwhile, Jack Malone's boots thudded down the precinct's polished halls, a sharp, rhythmic beat that turned heads. At 58, he was a throwback, a grizzled monument to an era when his word was law, his glare a weapon. His face, etched with deep lines and crowned with graying hair, bore the scars of decades spent clinging to a fading world. Jack still saw himself as the last true cop in a place overrun by what he sneered at as soft rule-estables, de-escalation, politics. The precinct thrummed around him, alive with chatter and the clink of coffee mugs, but he moved through it like a ghost, his disdain a shield against the younger officers who dared greet him. "Morning, sir," one chirped, voice bright with optimism. Jack didn't glance his way. "Yeah, sure it is," he growled, brushing past, his bitterness a cloud trailing in his wake. Jack didn't hate the job, it was his marrow, his identity boot. The world had shifted beneath his feet, leaving him stranded. The night before still burned in his mind, a snapshot of what he called real policing. He'd been cruising a ritzy neighborhood, the kind where manicured lawns and sleek mansions whispered wealth. A black Tesla gleamed under a streetlight, its driver a young black man in a sharp suit scrolling his phone with a comm. That grated on Jack's nerves, his pulse quickened, a familiar heat rising. That car, that Manthe, didn't fit Jack's rigid map of how things should be. He'd pulled over, flashlight slicing through the dusk, his voice a bark, license and registration. Justice, to Jack, was a hammer, not a scaly, and he wielded it without hesitation. Blind to the lesson Williams had learned, power unchecked was a hollow throne, crumbling under its own weight. The night was thick with the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears, interrupted only by the hum of tires slicing through the damp asphalt. Ryan Carter sat behind the wheel of his sleek Tesla, the glow of his phone casting faint shadows across his chiseled features. He was mid-scroll, lost in the mundane rhythm of messages, when a sharp voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "Hands where I can see them," it commanded, clipped and heavy with authority. Ryan's head lifted slowly, his dark eyes narrowing as they met the silhouette of Officer Jack Matters framed in the window. A flicker of irritation sparked in his chest, but his face remained a mask of unshaken calm, smooth as polished stone. "Of course, officer," he replied, his voice a steady current, polite yet edged with something unspoken. He shifted in his seat, reaching across to the passenger side where his wallet rested on the leather upholstery, its worn edges catching the faint gleam of streetlights. With a deliberate motion, he slid out his license and registration, handing them over to Jack with the ease of a man who'd done this dance before. Jack snatched the documents, his fingers brushing the paper with a roughness that betrayed his mood. He held them up to the dim light, scrutinizing every detail as if hunting for a crack in Ryan's composure. The car was registered to Ryan Carter, no surprise there. The license was pristinino tickets, no warnings, not even a whisper of trouble. It should have been enough, but Jack's smirk told a different story. "Nice car," he drawled, the words dripping with a sarcasm that tugged at the corners of his mouth. "What do you do, Carter? Rapper, athlete? Or maybe you've got some side gig I should know about?" Ryan's jaw tightened, a subtle ripple of tension beneath his skin, but his expression held steady, unflinching. Inside, a storm brewed anger, yes, but also a weary resignation. He'd faced this before, the assumptions, the sneers, the unspoken accusations painted across his existence like graffiti. "I'm a corporate attorney," he said, his voice a low, even keel, each syllable measured to keep the tide of frustration at bay. Jack let out a bark of laughter, sharp and mocking, shaking his head as he began to circle the car like a predator sizing up its prey. "Corporate attorney," he echoed, the words twisted into a parody of disbelief. "Right? And I'm the Pope." Ryan's hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, fingers curling just enough to betray the pressure building within. He stared straight ahead, the dashboard lights reflecting in his eyes like distant stars. "Is there something wrong with my documents, officer?" he asked, his tone still polite but laced with a thread of defiance that shimmered in the dark pools of his gaze. Jack leaned in close, his breath fogging the open window, his face a mask of barely concealed irritation. "You tell me," he snapped, his voice low and probing. "A guy like you, driving a car like this, it seems a little suspicious, don't you think?" "No," Ryan replied, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, firm and unyielding. He turned his head, meeting Jack's stare head-on, a quiet challenge burning in his eyes. That flicker of resistance ignited something in Jack, a flare of anger, a need to assert control. He straightened up, tapping the car's frame, with his knuckles as he ran the plates through his system, hoping, praying for a hit, a stolen vehicle, an unpaid fine, anything to justify the itch in his gut. The screen blinked back at him, clean, no warrants, no flags, nothing. But Jack wasn't done. Not yet. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice hardening into a wall of authority. Ryan's brows furrowed, a crease forming across his forehead as confusion mingled with indignation. "Is there a reason for that?" he asked, his calm fraying at the edges. "I've done nothing wrong." Jack's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning to a razor's edge. "You don't get to ask questions," he barked out. "Now." A heavy sigh escaped Ryan as he unbuckled his seatbelt, the click echoing in the silence. He stepped out, his polished shoes hitting the pavement with a soft thud, and stood tall, shoulders squared, spine straight, his tailored suit a quiet testament to his dignity. Jack began to frisk him, hands rough and invasive, patting down the crisp fabric of his jacket. It was unnecessary, humiliating, and they both knew it. Ryan's chest tightened, his breath shallow as he fought to keep his composure. His pride a fragile thread stretched to its limit. "You carrying anything I should know about?" Jack asked, his tone sharp as he lingered over the search, drawing it out as if daring Ryan to crack. "No, officer," Ryan replied, his voice flat, a wall of restraint holding back the fury simmering beneath. Jack's hands paused, hovering over Ryan's frame, waiting for a flinch, a trembly thing to feed his ego. But Ryan stood like a statue, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond Jack. A silent declaration, "You don't break me." After what felt like an endless stretch of time, Jack stepped back, his smirk fading into a grudging scowl. "All right," he muttered, waving a dismissive hand. "You're free to go." Ryan adjusted his jacket, smoothing the wrinkles with slow, precise movements, his calm a shield against the indignity. "Thank you," he said, his voice stripped of emotional sarcasm, no bitterness, just a hollow formality. He slid back into the driver's seat, the engine purring to life as he pulled away, the Tesla's taillights fading into the night. Jack stood there, hands on his hips, watching the car disappear down the empty street. A smug satisfaction curled in his chest. He had no evidence, no cause, but in his mind, he'd put another man in his place, taught another lesson. "That's right," he muttered under his breath, climbing back into his patrol car, the taste of power lingering on his tongue. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with a restless energy that Jack couldn't ignore. He strode into the conference room for the daily briefing, his boots scuffing the linoleum floor, his broad shoulders cutting through the clusters of whispering officers, their voices hushed as he passed, their glances darting between amusement and unease. "What's all the fuss about?" he grumbled, his gruff tone slicing through the chatter like a dull blade. A younger officer, Tim, shifted awkwardly, his freckled face caught between a grin and a grimace. "New chief's coming in today," he said, scratching the back of his neck. Jack snorted, rolling his eyes as he dropped into his usual seat near the back, the chair creaking under his weight. "Great," he muttered, crossing his arms. "Another desk jockey here to preach about rules and paperwork. Probably some kid straight out of college, no clue what the streets are like, with a laundry list of crap we're doing wrong." Tim offered a weak smile, but said nothing, retreating to his own seat as the room settled into an uneasy hush. Jack leaned back, his fingers drumming against his arm, his patience already fraying at the thought of sitting through some sanctimonious speech about reform and accountability. The door swung open, and a ripple of silence swept through the room. Jack didn't bother looking up at first, his gaze fixed on the chip table in front of him, until the weight of the moment pressed against him. He lifted his eyes and froze. Standing at the front of the room was Ryan Carter, impeccable in a crisp gray suit that hugged his frame like it was tailored by the gods. His presence filled the space, calm but commanding, his dark eyes sweeping over the sea of uniforms with a quiet intensity. For a fleeting second, they landed on Jack, and though no recognition flickered in Ryan's expression, Jack felt the air leave his lungs. "Good morning," Ryan began, his voice a smooth, confident thread that wove through the room. "My name is Ryan Carter, and I'll be your new chief of police." Jack's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as the blood drained from his face. His mind spun, a chaotic whirl of disbelief and dread. How? How could the man he'd stopped, the man he'd frisked and mocked, no stand here, towering over the entire department as his superior? Ryan's words flowed on, steady and deliberate, outlining his vision, rebuilding trust with the community, tackling systemic rot, holding every officer accountable. Each sentence landed like a stone in Jack's gut, the weight of justice and consequence sinking deeper with every breath. The briefing ended, and the officers filed out, their murmurs a low hum of curiosity and speculation. Jack stayed rooted to his seat, his broad frame hunched as if the ceiling might collapse on him. "Matters," Ryan's voice called out, calm but unyielding, slicing through the fog of Jack's thoughts. He looked up, his stomach twisting into knots as Ryan gestured toward him with a slight nod. "A word in my office." Jack swallowed hard, his usual swagger crumbling like dry earth. He rose slowly, each step down the hallway a march toward judgment, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a chorus of accusation. Inside the office, Ryan closed the door with a soft click, the sound reverberating in Jack's ears like a gavel. He leaned casually against the desk, arms crossed, his posture relaxed yet radiating authority. "Have a seat, Officer Matters," he said, motioning to the chair across from him. Jack sat, his jaw clenched so tight it ached, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his uniform shirt, a nervous tick he hadn't felt since his first day on the job. Ryan's eyes bore into him, steady and unrelenting, peeling back layers of bravado Jack had spent years building. "Look, Chief," Jack started, his voice rough as gravel, "about last night." Ryan raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture so calm it felt like a trap. "We'll get to that," he said, his tone firm yet devoid of malice. "First, let me tell you why I'm here." And with that, Ryan began to unravel a story of ambition, of struggle, of a man who'd clawed his way up from nothing to wield power with purpose. Jack sat there, the tension thick enough to choke on, realizing too late the lesson he'd stumbled into: power abused in the dark has a way of finding the light, and justice, when it comes, spares no one. The air in the room hung thick with tension, a storm brewing beneath the surface as Jack sat across from Ryan, his knuckles whitening around the arms of the chair. He was furioso. He could feel the heat of it bubbling up inside him, a molten anger that threatened to spill over, but he swallowed it down, forcing himself to breathe, to keep his composure. He wanted to handle this the way he'd always prided himself on professionally, with the steady hand of a man who'd spent decades wearing the badge. Yet as Ryan leaned forward, his elbows pressing into the desk, his voice sharpened like the edge of a blade, slicing through the fragile calm Jack clung to. "Let me be crystal clear," Ryan said, his eyes narrowing. "That kind of behavior, it's got no place in my department now, not ever." Jack's throat tightened, his pride wrestling with the bitter truth threading through Ryan's words. He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under him, and jutted his chin out defiantly. 35 years, he shot back, his voice rough and low, hardening with every syllable. "I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive, kid. I've waded through filth you couldn't even dream of, and you dare sit there and preach to me like I'm some rookie who doesn't know the ropes." His chest heaved as he spoke, memories of late-night stakeouts, blood-soaked crime scenes, and the endless grind of the job flashing behind his eyes. He'd earned his stripes, hadn't he? Didn't that count for something? But Ryan didn't flinch. His voice cut through Jack's tirade like a guillotine dropping, sharp and unyielding. "Stop." The single word landed heavy, silencing the room. His face darkened, shadows pooling under his brow, though his composure remained a steel wall, unshaken. "This isn't about how many years you've clocked or the horrors you've witnessed. This is about what you've done and what you're going to do about it now." The accusation hung there, a noose tightening around Jack's chest. His pulse hammered in his ears, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the hum of the precinct beyond the office door. Anger surged up his throat, hot and choking. Woe did this upstart think he was? Some greenhorn barely out of the academy, questioning a veteran like him? Didn't the decades of sweat and sacrifice mean anything anymore? Ryan eased back in his chair, the springs groaning faintly under his weight, and studied Jack with a gaze that felt like it could peel back skin. For a moment, the silence stretched taut between them, a wire ready to snap. Then Ryan spoke again, his tone measured but carrying a weight that pressed into Jack's bones. "I wrestled with how to handle this," he admitted, his fingers drumming once against the desk. "But after what went down last night, I figured the only way forward is to lay it all out plain and honest." He paused, letting the gravity settle, his next words deliberate, like stones dropped into still water. "Do you remember Samuel Carter?" Jack blinked, the name tugging at some dusty corner of his memory, faint and elusive, like a whisper from a dream he couldn't quite place. "Carter," he echoed, his brow furrowing as he leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "Should I?" His voice wavered, cautious now, a crack forming in his bravado as unease coiled in his gut. Ryan's lips pressed into a thin line, his tone cool but edged with something raw, something that cut deeper than Jack expected. "You should." The words landed like a punch, reverberating through Jack's chest. 15 years ago, you put the cuffs on him. The floor seemed to shift beneath Jack's boots as the memory clawed its way to the Surfacia drug bust from the mid-2000s, a gritty case involving a man pegged as a mid-level dealer, Samuel Carter. Jack could almost smell the stale air of the precinct back then, hear the clatter of typewriters and the buzz of fluorescent lights as he'd booked the guy. He'd been so sure of the intel, hadn't he? Solid evidence, airtight leads, or so he'd thought. But now, the details blurred, muddied by the passage of time and the countless cases that had piled up since. "I don't see where you're going with this," Jack said, his voice tight, though the sinking feeling in his stomach told him he might not want to know. Ryan leaned forward again, his hands clasped on the desk, his voice steady, but laced with a quiet fury that made the hairs on Jack's neck stand up. "Here's the connection, Jack. Samuel Carter was my father." The revelation hit like a freight train barreling through the room, knocking the air from Jack's lungs. His jaw slackened, his mouth falling open as the walls seemed to tilt and spin around him. His mind raced, fragments of thought collating Samuel Carter, the arrest, the trial, but nothing coherent took shape. He stared at Ryan, searching the younger man's face for some hint of a bluff. But all he found was a steely resolve that mirrored the dread pooling in his gut. "My father," Ryan went on, his voice unwavering despite the storm brewing behind his eyes, "went down for drug charges, based on evidence your team scraped together, evidence that was shaky at best, and at worst, a outright lie stitched up to close the books." Jack bristled, his defenses surging back to life. "Now wait just a damn minute," he started, his voice rising, but Ryan cut him off, his tone snapping like a whip. "No, you wait," Ryan said, his composure cracking just enough to let the molten anger beneath seep through. "I've spent years digging through those case files. I've pored over every report, every scribbled note, every so-called witness statement. And you know what I found? Nothing. No solid proof. No credible witness, just a rush job to wrap it up and a man's life torn apart in the wreckage." Jack's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to hold his ground. "If he went down, it wasn't just me," he snapped, his voice trembling with defiance. "There was a jury. A judge didn't pin this all on me like I'm the only one who—" "Stop passing the buck," Ryan interrupted, his words sharp enough to draw blood. "You were the lead officer. You signed off on those reports. You built that case. Jack, every flimsy piece of it." The accusation landed like a sledgehammer, and Jack shot to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the worn linoleum floor. "What do you want me to say?" he barked, his voice echoing off the walls. "That I screwed up, that I'm sorry. Fine, I'm sorry. I can't undo what's done." His chest heaved, his breath ragged, but the words felt hollow even as they left his mouth. Ryan didn't move, didn't blink, his gaze cold and unyielding as he remained seated. "You're right," he said quietly, the calm in his voice more unnerving than any shout. "You can't change the past, but you can own up to it, and you can help me make it right." Jack let out a bitter, jagged laugh, shaking his head as he paced the small office, his boots thudding against the floor. "Make it right? What the hell does that even mean? The case is ancient history. It's overdone. Buried." "Not anymore," Ryan replied, rising to his feet now, his height matching Jack's as he met his gaze head-on. "I'm reopening it, and I want you on board." Jack froze, staring at him in disbelief, his mouth working soundlessly for a moment. "You're out of your mind," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Ryan shot back, his tone icy, his eyes boring into Jack's with a ferocity that made the older man flinch. "I'm going to clear my father's name. I'm going to shine a light on every screw-up, every corner cut in that investigation where you're with me or not. But you're in this, Jack. Like it or not." The words hit like a gut punch, and Jack felt the ground dissolve beneath him. He shook his head, running a trembling hand through his graying hair, the strands damp with sweat. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to drag this whole department through the dirt over something from 15 years ago?" Ryan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "If dragging this department through the dirt is what it takes to get to the truth, then so be it. And if you've got even a shred of honor left in you, you'd want the same." Jack's fists tightened, his jaw locking as every muscle in his body screamed to lash out, to shove Ryan aside and storm out of this suffocating room. But something in the younger man's stareth unshakable conviction. The quiet fire burning there rooted him to the spot. For the first time in years, a cold wave of shame washed over him, prickling his skin and settling deep in his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. Trapped in the weight of that moment, the silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, until Ryan broke it. His voice softer now but no less firm. "I'm not asking for the impossible, Jack. I'm asking for accountability. And I'm giving you a choice. Help me uncover the truth, or keep hiding behind the lie that you did nothing wrong. But if you pick the second option, don't think for a second I'll shield you when the consequences come crashing down." Jack looked away, his gaze dropping to the scuffed floorboards. Unable to bear the intensity of Ryan's stare, the words pressed against him, heavy and unyielding, like a boulder pinning him in place. He had no answer, not yet. His tongue felt thick, useless, as his mind churned with a storm of guilt and defiance. Ryan stepped back, his expression unreadable now, a mask of calm over the fury beneath. "Think it over," he said simply, then turned on his heel and strode out of the office, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in Jack's ears. Alone now, Jack sank back into the chair, his legs giving out as he buried his face in his hands. The room felt too small, the air too thin, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the cop he'd always been. He felt like the villain in someone else's story, stripped bare and drowning in a guilt he couldn't outrun. He hated every gnawing second of it. That night, Jack sat in his beat-up sedan, parked outside a lonely diner on the outskirts of town. The neon sign buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow across the cracked asphalt. His coffee sat untouched on the dashboard, long gone cold, the steam a distant memory. He stared out the windshield. The world beyond blurred into a haze as his mind replayed the confrontation with Ryan over and over, each word a splinter digging deeper under his skin. 15 years ago, he would have laughed in the face of anyone who dared challenge his methods back when he was untouchable, a titan in the precinct, a man who got results. But now the foundation he'd built his life on felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He thought about Samuel Carter, piecing together the fragments of that old case. The mid-2000s had been a pressure cooker city breathing down the department's neck. After a string of botched drug raids, the public screaming for justice, and the brass demanding collars, Jack remembered his old partner, Detective Mike Reynolds, a weary guy with a quick laugh and a quicker temper. Mike had been the one to drag in the informant, a jittery kid with a rap sheet longer than Jack's arm, swearing up and down that Carter was the linchpin in some sprawling drug ring. The bust had gone smooth to smooth. Maybe Jack had slapped the cuffs on Carter himself, feeling the familiar rush of a job well done. But now, staring into the dark beyond the diner's flickering lights, he wondered, had he asked enough questions? Had he pushed Mike to double-check the kid's story? Or had he just wanted the win so bad he'd ignored the cracks? It was all by the book, he muttered to himself, the words tasting like ash as they left his mouth. But the certainty he'd once carried like armor was gone, replaced by a gnawing doubt that clawed at his insides. The next morning, Ryan summoned him back to the office. Jack trudged down the hall, his usual swagger replaced by a quiet slump, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the night's sleepless hours. The precinct buzzed around him, phones ringing. Officers laughing over stale coffee, but it all felt distant, like he was moving through a fog. He stepped into Ryan's office, the door creaking shut behind him with a dull thud. Ryan sat at his desk, a thick manila folder splayed open before him. Papers spilling across the wood like the guts of some long-buried beast. "Close the door," Ryan said without looking up, his voice clipped. Jack obeyed, easing into the same chair he'd occupied the day before, the leather still warm from yesterday's battle. Ryan finally lifted his head, fixing Jack with that same piercing stare that seemed to see right through him. "I've been preparing for this for years," he began, his hand resting on the folder, fingers tapping lightly against the worn edges. "I've tracked down every scrap of evidence, every transcript, every witness I could find. And here's what I know beyond a shadow of a doubt: the case against my father was a house of cards, built on lies and quick fixes." Jack's stomach twisted, a sour churn that made him shift uncomfortably. He didn't speak, didn't trust himself to, just waited as Ryan flipped through the folder, pulling out a yellowed report with Jack's own signature scrawled at the bottom. "I've already talked to the DA's office," Ryan continued, his voice steady, but laced with a quiet triumph. "They're willing to take a fresh look, new eyes, new questions, and I'm not stopping until every stone's turned over." Jack stared at the report, the ink faded but the weight of it as heavy as ever. He could feel the ghosts of that case crowding around him, Samuel Carter's bewildered face, as the cuffs clicked shut, Mike's smug grin as they'd toasted the bust over beers, the informant's nervous fidgeting as he'd rattled off his story. Justice, Jack had always told himself, was messy but necessary. But what if it hadn't been justice at all? What if it had been a rush to judgment? A power trip dressed up as duty? The thought made his chest ache, a dull throb that spread to his fingertips. Ryan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This isn't just about my father, Jack. It's about what happens when power goes unchecked, when men like you stop asking questions and start bending the rules to fit the story they want to tell. You've got a chance here to do something right, to face the consequences you helped set in motion. So what's it gonna be?" Jack's hands trembled as he gripped the arms of the chair, the room closing in around him. He thought of Mike, long retired now, probably fishing somewhere upstate, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. He thought of the department, the men and women he'd stood shoulder to shoulder with, and how this could tear through them all like a wildfire. But most of all, he thought of Samuel Carter, a man he barely remembered, a life he'd helped shatter, in the sun sitting across from him, demanding not just answers, but accountability. For the first time in his career, Jack didn't have a quick comeback, no shield of bravado to hide behind. The lesson staring him in the face was brutal and clear. Justice wasn't just about catching the bad guys, it was about owning the fallout when you got it wrong. And as Ryan watched him, waiting for an answer, Jack felt the full weight of that truth settle into his bones, heavy and inescapable. Jack sat hunched over in his worn leather chair, the dim light of his office casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee, and the faint hum of the precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. His chest tightened as Ryan's words echoed in his mind, each syllable pressing down on him like a physical weight. "I'm asking you to tell the truth," Ryan had said, his voice sharp yet steady, cutting through the haze of Jack's defenses. Jack's fingers twitched, itching to lash out, to shove the accusation back in Ryan's face. But beneath the flicker of defiance, a deeper unease gnawed at him, a quiet, persistent whisper he'd spent years trying to silence. What if Ryan was right? What if the job he'd clung to as a shield had been built on a lie? Ryan stood across the desk, his posture rigid, his dark eyes locked onto Jack with an intensity that made the older man shift uncomfortably. There was no malice in Ryan's gaze, not yet. But there was something else, something raw and unyielding, a son's desperate need to reclaim what had been stolen from his father. "If you didn't do anything wrong, then you've got nothing to worry about, right?" Ryan pressed, his tone softening just enough to catch Jack off guard. It wasn't a taunt, it was a plea wrapped in a challenge, and it landed like a stone in Jack's gut. He wanted to argue, to tell Ryan he didn't understand the pressures of the badge, the relentless grind that forced split-second choices, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, He felt the suffocating weight of his own career, the arrests, the convictions. The countless times he'd told himself he was just following orders settle over him like a shroud. Ryan took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though it carried the force of a shout. "Look, Jack, I'm not here to ruin you. If that was my goal, I'd have gone straight to the priest, plastered your name across every front page from here to the coast, but I didn't. I came to you." He paused, letting the words sink in, his expression softening with a flicker of something Jack hadn't expected: hope. "I believe people can change. I believe you can change. But I need you to meet me halfway." The sincerity in Ryan's voice was disarming, and Jack felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years: guilt, yes, but also a faint spark of possibility. Could he really turn back the clock on the mistakes he'd buried? Jack leaned back, the creak of his chair breaking the silence as he let out a long, ragged sigh. His hands rested on his knees, fingers curling into the fabric of his pants as he wrestled with the decision. "And if I don't?" he asked, his voice rough, testing the waters. Ryan's gaze hardened instantly, the warmth vanishing as if a switch had been flipped. "Then I'll do it without you," he said, his words clipped and final. "And when the truth comes out, because it will come out, I'll have to live with knowing you could have made it right but chose to sit there instead." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, and Jack felt it press against his ribs like a vise. He stared at Ryan, then down at the desk, the scuffwood blurring as his thoughts churned. Finally, he nodded, a small, reluctant gesture. "All right," he muttered, barely audible. "What do you need from me?" The next move was to dig into the past, to peel back the layers of a case Jack had once thought airtight. Ryan slid a thick folder across the desk, its edges worn from handling, and opened it with a deliberate slowness that made Jack's stomach twist. Page after page spilled out reports, statements, timelines so meticulously arranged, a silent testament to Ryan's relentless pursuit. "Start here," Ryan said, tapping a finger on a yellowed sheet. "This is the informant's testimony. Says my father was running drugs out of his auto shop. But look at this." He flipped to another page, pointing to a factory log. "My dad was clocked in for an overnight shift 30 miles away when this supposedly happened. The times don't line up." Jack squinted at the document, the faded ink swimming before his eyes. A memory flickered: Reynolds hauling in a scrawny kid, barely 18, wide-eyed and jittery. "I remember him," Jack said, his voice tight. "Reynolds brought him in, said he had solid info." Ryan's eyes narrowed, a storm brewing behind them. "Did you ever question it? Ever wonder if that kid was just saying what you wanted to hear to save his own skin?" Jack hesitated, the question slicing through years of rationalizations. "We didn't have time," he said finally, the excuse sounding hollow even to himself. "We were under pressure. Chief wanted results, arrests, numbers. We couldn't poke holes in every story." Ryan's face darkened, his hands curling into fists on the desk. "That pressure cost my father 15 years, he said, his voice trembling with a fury he could barely contain. Jack looked away, the shame clawing at him like a living thing. He'd never met Samuel Carter, never seen the man whose life he'd helped unravel. But now he could almost feel him, a ghost hovering in the room, demanding answers. "What about his lawyer?" Jack asked, grasping for something, anything, to shift the blame. Ryan's laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through the tension like a blade. "His public defender, guy was fresh out of law school, drowning in cases. My family couldn't afford anyone better." He skimmed the file, showed up half asleep, and let the prosecution steamroll him. "My dad didn't stand a chance." Jack slumped further, the enormity of the failure crashing over him. He'd always told himself justice was a machine perfect, sure, but functional. Now, staring at the wreckage of Samuel Carter's life, he saw it for what it was, a sham, propped up by apathy and ambition, and he'd been one of its gears. Over the next few weeks, Jack and Ryan forged an uneasy alliance, sifting through the debris of the past. The precinct's conference room became their war zone, its chip table buried under stacks of files and coffee cups. The air crackled with tension, silences stretched taut, broken only by the rustle of paper or the occasional flare of an argument. "You missed this," Ryan would snap, shoving a witness statement at Jack, who'd bristle and mutter, "I'm not your damn secretary." But beneath the friction, something shifted. Jack began to see the case through Ryan's iced sloppy timelines, the shaky witnesses, the outright negligence that had locked an innocent man away. One afternoon, as rain drummed against the precinct windows, Jack stared at a report and felt the words slip out before he could stop them. "I think Reynolds planted the evidence." Ryan's head snapped up, his pen frozen mid-scribble. "What?" Jack swallowed, his throat dry, hands balling into fists. "The drugs in your dad's shop, they never made sense. No record, no connections. But Reynolds was dead set we'd find something. He kept pushing. Said we'd look stupid if we came up empty." Ryan's jaw clenched, his breath coming slow and deliberate. "And you went along with it. It wasn't a question." Jack met his gaze, shame etched into every line of his face. "I didn't know for sure. Didn't want to know. I trusted him." Ryan leaned back, exhaling sharply. "If he planted it, the whole case collapses," he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and dawning realization. Jack nodded, the weight of his own words anchoring him. "And your dad gets his name back." That night, Jack sat alone in his cramped apartment, the glow of a single lamp illuminating the clutter of his life-empty beer cans, a sagging couch, a career reduced to regrets. On the coffee table sat an old photo, him and Reynolds, fresh-faced and grinning, badges gleaming on their uniforms. They'd been invincible back then, or so they'd thought, fueled by ambition and a naive belief they could clean up the streets. Now, Jack barely recognized the man he'd been. How had they strayed so far? How had they become the corrupt shadows of the cops they'd once despised? His hand trembled as he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't touched in years. The line crackled, then a gruff voice answered. "Reynolds." Jack's grip tightened. "Mike, it's Jack." A pause, thick with unspoken history. "Well, I'll be damned. What do you want?" Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself. "We need to talk about Samuel Carter." The silence that followed was suffocating, a void filled with 15 years of buried secrets. Then Reynolds spoke, his voice low and guarded. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jack's resolve hardened. "Yeah, you do. And you're going to help me fix it." The meeting was set for the next day, at a dilapidated diner on the city's outskirts, a grimy relic with cracked vinyl booths and flickering neon signs. Jack arrived early, his untouched coffee growing cold as he watched the door. When Reynolds walked in, the years hit Jack like a punch. The man's leather jacket hung loose on a frame that had lost its swagger, his gray hair cropped close to a weathered scalp, but his eye sharp, calculating were the same, cutting through the haze of time. Reynolds slid into the booth, the leather creaking under him. "All right, matters," he said. His tone clipped, breaking the uneasy quiet. "What's this about? You don't call me for years, and now you're dragging up Samuel Carter." Jack leaned forward, hands clasped tight to steady himself. "It's not over, Mike. Never has been. You know that." Reynolds smirked, a bitter edge to it, shaking his head. "You're kidding me. After all this time, you're growing a conscience." Jack's jaw tightened, but he pressed on. "It's not about me. It's about the truth. Ryan Carter's the new chief. He's reopened the case, and he's got evidence, to make it ugly. I need to know, did you plant those drugs?" Reynolds froze, his smirk fading into something colder, more guarded. He stared at Jack, the diner's hum fading into the background as the moment stretched. Finally, he sighed, his eyes narrowing. "You really want to know?" Jack's pulse hammered. "Yes." Reynolds leaned back, his voice dropping to a chilling monotone. "Yeah, I did. Planted them myself." Jack's stomach lurched, the confession slamming into him like a freight train. He'd suspected it, feared it, but hearing it aloud made it real ugly and irreversible. "Why, Mike?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why the hell would you do that?" Reynolds shrugged, unrepentant. "Because we needed a win. The brass was breathing down our necks, and Carter was an easy target. It's how the game's played." "Jack, you knew that." The words hung there, a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked power. Jack's hands shook as he processed how a single act of corruption had rippled outward, shattering a man's life, a family's trust, and now his own fragile sense of self. For years, he'd run from the truth, hiding behind the badge. But as he sat across from Reynolds, the man who'd once been his brother in arms, now a stranger, Jack knew the time for running was over. Justice, he realized, wasn't just about punishment, it was about facing the consequences, no matter how late. And for Samuel Carter, for Ryan, and for himself, he'd fight to set it right. The air in the city had felt suffocating back then, thick with desperation and the relentless clamor of a department drowning under scrutiny. Every corner of the precinct buzzed with tension, the kind that gnawed at your nerves and left you restless. The press swarmed like vultures, their headlines screaming accusations, while politicians loomed over every decision, their voices sharp and demanding, insisting on results no matter the cost. Jack could still feel the weight of it all pressing against his chest, a constant reminder that they were teetering on the edge of failure. They needed a victorism thing, anything to silence the chaos. And Samuel Carter, a man whose name now carried the bitter tang of regret in Jack's mouth, had been the easiest target, the most convenient piece to fit into their crumbling puzzle. Jack's voice trembled with a raw, rising fury as he spat the word back at Reynolds. Convenient. His hands tightened into fists on the scratch wooden table of the diner, knuckles whitening as the memory of Samuel's wide, disbelieving eyes flashed through his mind. He was innocent, Mike. A good man with a life ahead of him, and you tore it apart like it was nothing. His chest heaved, the anger surging like a tide he couldn't hold back, threatening to spill over and drown everything in its path. Reynolds, sitting across from him, leaned forward, his face a mask of stone, eyes glinting with a cold defiance that made Jack's stomach twist. "Don't play the saint with me, Jack," he said, his voice low and cutting. "You knew the game we were playing. Maybe you didn't plant the drugs yourself, but you didn't stop it either. You turned your head, kept your mouth shut, because asking questions would have meant facing truths you weren't ready for." The words hit Jack like a punch, stealing the air from his lungs. He wanted to shout back, to fling a defense into Reynolds' smug face, but the protest died in his throat, choked by the heavy truth. He had known something was wrong, had felt it in the pit of his gut every time Reynolds smirked or dodged a question, but he'd let it slide. He'd told himself it was for the greater good, that one closed case would lift the pressure off them all. Now, staring into Reynolds' unrepentant gaze, Jack's fists unclenched, his hands falling limp as shame washed over him. He'd been part of it, even if his hands hadn't touched the evidence bag. Complicity clung to him like a second skin, and he couldn't shake it off. "You need to come clean, Mike," Jack said, forcing his voice to steady, though it carried the weight of a plea. "Ryan's digging into this, and he's sure will figure it out. When he does, you'll be buried under it. If you admit what happened, maybe we can." Reynolds cut him off with a laugh, a harsh, hollow sound that echoed through the diner's greasy air. "You think I'm gonna fall on my sword for you, for him? Forget it, Jack. I've got no confession to spill." He stood abruptly, tossing a crumpled handful of bills onto the table, the coins clattering against the chipped surface. Jack's anger flared hotter, a wildfire roaring in his chest. "This isn't about saving yourself, Mike. It's about doing what's right just once in your miserable life." Reynolds paused at the door, his back stiff, then turned his head just enough to shoot Jack a look of pure disdain. "The right thing. That train left the station years ago, pal. Good luck with your little hero act. I'm not part of it." The door slammed shut behind him, the sharp bang reverberating in Jack's ears as he sat there, alone, his head dropping into his hands. The diner's hum faded to a dull roar in his mind, and he wondered how he'd let the lines blur so badly, how he'd drifted so far from the man he'd once wanted to be. The next morning, Jack sat in the chief's office, the room's stark, fluorescent light casting harsh shadows across his face. His hands rested heavily on the polished desk, fingers twitching with the nervous energy he couldn't suppress. Ryan, the chief, watched him with piercing eyes, his posture rigid, exuding an authority that made Jack feel small. He'd called Jack in for an update on the Samuel Carter case, but Jack's thoughts were still tangled in the wreckage of his confrontation with Reynolds. While Ryan's voice sliced through the silence, sharp and impatient. "Did you talk to him?" Jack nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Yeah, I did." Ryan leaned forward, his gaze narrowing like a hawk zeroing in on prey. "And what did he say?" Jack hesitated, the truth sitting like a stone in his chest. He could feel Ryan's scrutiny boring into him, demanding answers. Finally, he drew a deep breath. the air shuddering in his lungs. He admitted it. He said, the words tasting bitter. Reynolds planted the drugs. Ryan's face hardened, his jaw clenching so tight Jack could see the muscle twitch. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossing over his chest, a storm brewing behind his eyes. I knew it, he muttered, almost to himself. I knew it the second I opened that file. Jack dropped his gaze to his hands, unable to bear the intensity of Ryan's stare. I didn't know back then, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. But I should have. I should have pushed harder, asked more. I should have stopped it. Ryan's response was ice cold, cutting through the room's heavy air. But you didn't. Jack swallowed hard, the admission burning in his throat. No, I didn't. Silence settled over them, thick and oppressive, stretching out until it felt like the walls were closing in. Ryan broke it at last, his voice low but resolute. So what now? Jack straightened, forcing himself to meet Ryan's unflinching gaze. I'll testify, he said, the decision solidifying in his chest like a vow. I'll back you up, give you whatever you need. I can't erase what happened, but I can help fix it. Ryan studied him, his expression a mask Jack couldn't read. After a long, agonizing moment, he nodded. All right, but know this, it's not just about clearing my father's name. It's about accountability. Everyone who had a hand in this answers for it. Jack nodded, the weight of Ryan's words sinking deep. I get it. The weeks that followed were a blur of relentless effort, a whirlwind that swept Jack and Ryan into a shared mission. Together, they pieced together the fractured truth of Samuel Carter's case, each discovery a jagged shard of a broken system. Jack poured out everything he remembered at the department's suffocating pressure to deliver results, the unspoken rules that rewarded shortcuts, his own cowardice in staying silent while Reynolds orchestrated the frame-up. Every word he wrote in his statements felt like peeling back a layer of his own guilt, exposing the rot he'd helped nurture. It wasn't enough to undo the years Samuel had lost, but it was a step, a shaky, imperfect step toward something better. Ryan, meanwhile, was a force of nature, driven by a quiet fury that burned beneath his calm exterior. He tracked down witnesses whose voices had been silenced by threats, coaxing out their stories with a patience Jack envied. He unearthed forgotten files from dusty archives, documents that had been shoved into corners and left to rot, each one revealing another thread in the web of lies that had ensnared Samuel. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Samuel Carter's conviction wasn't just a mistake, it was a deliberate act of injustice, a sacrifice to appease a city baying for blood. But not everyone welcomed their efforts. The precinct turned into a battlefield of whispers and glares, the air thick with resentment. Jack felt it every time he walked through the house, eyes boring into his back, muttered curses trailing in his wake. He'd spent years building a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense cop, the kind who bent rules but got results. Now to some, he was a turncoat, a snitch who'd crossed an unforgivable line. One morning, he found a note taped to his locker, the word snitch scrawled in bold, angry marker. He ripped it down, crumpling it in his fist, the paper crackling under his grip. Their scorn didn't matter, not anymore. For the first time in too long, Jack felt a spark of purpose igniting within him, a fragile but growing belief that he was finally on the right path. The breakthrough came when Ryan tracked down the informant, who'd been the linchpin of Samuel's conviction. Once a scared kid under Reynolds' thumb, he was now a man with a wife and 2 little girls, living a quiet life far from the city's chaos. Sitting across from Ryan in a dimly lit kitchen, the man's hands shook as he recounted the pressure Reynolds had aptly had, threats to his family, the promises of Cashel to force a lie that sent an innocent man to prison. His voice cracked as he agreed to give a sworn statement, his wife hovering nearby, her eyes wide with worry but softened by pride. That testimony was another piece of the puzzle, a cornerstone in the case they were building. Armed with this new evidence, Ryan and Jack stormed the DA's office, laying out their findings with a precision that left no room for doubt. The DA, a weary man with a perpetually furrowed brow, resisted at first, his reluctance palpable as he shuffled papers and avoided their eyes. But the weight of the truth informant's confession, the tampered evidence, the coerced witnesses was too heavy to ignore. Finally, he agreed to file a motion to vacate Samuel Carter's conviction and launch an internal probe into the department's actions. As the news broke, the city erupted, and Jack found himself thrust into a spotlight he'd never sought. Reporters swarmed the precinct, their cameras flashing like lightning, their shouts blending into a deafening roar. He dodged them as best he could, head down, focusing on the work still ahead. One night, after a grueling day of meetings and endless paperwork, Jack sat alone in the precinct's break room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the chipped table where he rested his elbows. His badge gleamed faintly on his chest, and he stared at it, fingers brushing the cold metal as doubt gnawed at him. Did he still deserve it? Ryan walked in, his steps heavy with exhaustion, but his eyes alight with determination. He grabbed a water bottle from the fridge, the door creaking as it swung shut, and dropped into the chair across from Jack. "You did good today," Ryan said, his voice cutting through the silence. Jack looked up, startled. "Just trying to fix what I broke," he muttered. Ryan nodded, a flicker of warmth softening his stern features. "And you are. But this isn't just about what's behind you, it's about what's ahead." Jack met his gaze, a tentative hope stirring in his chest. "What's ahead?" he asked. Ryan's lips curved into a faint, weary smile. "We rebuild." The courtroom was alive with anticipation, every seat filled, the air humming with restless murmurs as people shifted in their places. Jack sat on a hard wooden bench near the front, his shoulders squared, but his hands clasped tightly in his lap, betraying the nerves twisting inside him. Beside him, Ryan sat still as stone, his face a mask of quiet intensity, his eyes fixed on the judge's bench. For Ryan, this wasn't just a hearing, it was a reckoning, the culmination of 15 years of pain and perseverance, a chance to reclaim his father's honor. Jack had been in countless courtrooms before, barking testimony or glaring down defendants. But this time was different. He wasn't here as a cop, not here to uphold the system he'd once served blindly. He was here to confront its failures, to help mend a wound that had festered for over a decade. The weight of that responsibility settled over him, heavy but grounding, a reminder of what serial justice could mean. At the front of the room, Samuel Carter sat beside his attorney, a figure carved from resilience and quiet dignity. His beard was streaked with gray, his face etched with lines that told a story of endurance. 15 years locked away for a crime he hadn't committed. Released on parole a year ago, he'd walked free, but the shadow of his conviction had clung to him, a stain no one had bothered to wipe away. Now, his eyes shone with a cautious hope, his hands resting calmly in his lap as he waited for the moment that could rewrite his legacy. Around him, the courtroom buzzed, the rustle of papers, the soft coughs of spectators, the faint creak of benches until the judge entered, and a hush fell like a curtain. The gavel struck, a single, resounding crack, and the hearing began. The DA's representative stepped forward, his voice steady as he presented the motion to vacate Samuel's conviction. He laid out the evidence with meticulous care, the informant's tearful confession, the gaps in the original case, the coercion that had twisted truth into a lie. Jack listened, his heart pounding, each word a brick in the wall they'd built to tear down an injustice. As the proceedings unfolded, he glanced at Samuel, saw the way his shoulders lifted slightly, the way his daughter, seated behind him, gripped her husband's hand, tears glistening in her eyes. This wasn't just about a legal record, it was about a man's life, a family's faith, a lesson in the cost of power wielded without conscience. For Jack, it was a mirror held up to his own failures, a chance to stand on the side of right after years of drifting in the gray. The hearing stretched on, but when the judge finally ruled vacating the conviction, declaring Samuel Carter an innocent man, the room erupted in a wave of gasps and muffled sobs. Jack felt Ryan's hand clap his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the fight they'd shared. As Samuel stood, embracing his family, Jack rose too, his chest tight with a mix of relief and resolve. Justice had been served, but it came with a precious stark reminder that power, unchecked, could destroy lives, and that redemption, though possible, was a road paved with hard truths. For the first time, Jack believed he could walk it. In the stillness of the courtroom, the air hung heavy with anticipation, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel deliberate. The witnesses had spoken, their voices weaving a tapestry of truth that could no longer be ignored. Evidence, cold and irrefutable, lay bare the ugly reality. The drugs had been planted, a calculated lie that had spiraled into a man's ruin. It was a stark, unflinching condemnation of a justice system that had buckled under its own weight, warped by the hands of those meant to uphold it. Ryan had poured his soul into uncovering this truth, piecing together the fragments of a case that had festered in the shadows for too long. Every late night, every whispered doubt, every moment of frustration had led him here, to this moment of reckoning. But it was Jack's voice that would tip the scales. When his name was called, the room seemed to hold its breath, the murmur of spectators fading into a hush so deep you could hear the faint creak of the wooden benches. Jack rose, his fingers fumbling briefly, with his tea and nervous tic betraying the storm brewing inside him. His steps echoed as he crossed the polished floor to the witness stand, each one a declaration of intent. As he placed his hand on the Bible and swore the oath, his eyes flickered toward Samuel Carter, seated just a few rows away. Samuel's gaze met his, sharp with a blend of curiosity and distrust, as if he were silently asking, "What will you do with my life now?" Jack's throat tightened, but when he spoke, his voice was a steady current cutting through the tension. He laid out the story in meticulous detail, shortcuts he'd taken, the questions he'd left unasked, the blind faith he'd placed in Mike Reynolds, a man he'd once called a brother. That trust had been a chain, binding an innocent man to a prison cell, and Jack didn't shy away from the wreckage it had caused. "I failed Samuel Carter," he said, the words tasting bitter as they left his mouth, heavy with a regret that had settled deep into his bones. "I let the system fail him, and for that, I am deeply, profoundly sorry." There was no plea for forgiveness, no attempt to soften the edges of his guilt. He stood there, raw and exposed, letting the truth carve its mark. When he stepped down, he kept his eyes on the floor, avoiding the sea of faces watching him. The thud of his heartbeat roared in his ears, a relentless drum roll that drowned out the whispers around him. Had he done enough? The question gnawed at him, sharp and persistent, as he sank back into his seat. Then came Ryan's hand on his shoulder, a firm, quiet gesture that felt like an anchor in the chaos. It wasn't absolution, but it was something close, a silent acknowledgement that carried more weight than words ever could. The hours dragged on, testimony piling upon testimony, until the judge's voice finally sliced through the haze. It was clear, unwavering, a beacon in the murk. "Samuel Carter's conviction is vacated." The words hung there, suspended in the air, before they crashed down like a wave. A ripple of gasps and muffled sobs spread through the room. Emotion breaking free from its restraints, Samuel sat frozen, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as if he couldn't trust his ears. Then, slowly, his head dipped, and his broad shoulders began to tremble with the force of silent tears of pain, spilling out in a flood he could no longer contain. Ryan was at his side in an instant, his hand resting gently on his father's back, a son steadying a man who'd been broken by the world. They embraced, their arms locking in a grip that spoke of lost time and fragile hope. And for the first time, in what felt like forever, the invisible chains that had bound them seemed to loosen, if only a little. Jack watched from his seat, a tangle of feelings churning inside him. Relief washed over him like a cool breeze, gratitude pulsed in his veins, but guilt lingered like a shadow he couldn't outrun. No courtroom victory, no string of apologies could rewind the clock and give Samuel back the years stolen from him, years of sunsets unseen, of laughter unheard, of a life unlived. Jack knew that truth as intimately as he knew his own failures. But as he saw Samuel's tear-streaked face buried in Ryan's shoulder, as he caught the faint, triumphant curve of Ryan's smile, a flicker of purpose ignited within him. This messy, imperfect moment was why it all mattered. The echoes of the case didn't fade with the judge's gavel. They rippled outward, shaking the precinct to its core. An internal investigation unfurled like a storm cloud, zeroing in on Mike Reynolds and the web of corruption he'd spun. Mike, once a towering figure in Jack's life, crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Cornered and stripped of his bravado, he confessed to planting the drugs, his voice hollow as he admitted the betrayal. The consequences were swift as pension vanished, criminal charges loomed, and the man who'd once stood shoulder to shoulder with Jack was reduced to a cautionary tale. But Jack found no joy in it. Watching Mike's fall was like staring into a cracked mirror, reflecting back the ideals they'd both abandoned somewhere along the way. Justice had been served, but it tasted more like ash than triumph, a bitter reminder of how power, when twisted, could corrode everything it touched. Under Ryan's steady hand, the department began to transform. He was a quiet force, his resolve as unyielding as steel. Training programs were torn down and rebuilt, policies rewritten with a focus on accountability, and community outreach became the heartbeat of their mission. Ryan dreamed of a precinct that didn't just enforce the law but lived it fairly honestly, with a reverence for the people it served. Slowly, that vision took root, sprouting in the form of officers who listened more than they lectured, who saw their badges as promises rather than shields. For Jack, the change was personal. He still wore the uniform, still carried the weight of the badge, but the man beneath it was different. Where he'd once barreled through cases with a certainty that bordered on arrogance, he now paused. He listened to the trembling voices of victims, to the wary eyes of suspects, to the eager questions of rookie cops who reminded him of a younger, less jaded version of himself. He mentored them with a patience he hadn't known he possessed, sharing stories of his missteps as much as his successes. He wasn't the untouchable enforcer anymore. He was a man who'd stumbled, who'd seen the cost of unchecked power, and who'd vowed to serve justice and not just wield it. One crisp evening, months after the hearing, Jack found himself on a park bench overlooking the city. The skyline stretched out before him, bathed in the golden glow of a setting sun. The air tinged with the sharp bite of autumn. Ryan had asked to meet him here, and Jack had agreed without hesitation, though he wasn't sure why. When Ryan arrived, he carried 2 steaming cups of coffee, the rich aroma curling into the cool air. He handed one to Jack with a nod and settled beside him. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the sun slipping lower, painting the world in hues of amber and rose. "You've been quiet lately," Ryan said at last, his tone light, but laced with a gentle curiosity. Jack shrugged, cradling the warm cup in his hands. "Just thinking." He took a sip, letting the heat seep into his chest, chasing away the chill. "About how I spent most of my career convinced I was on the right side of things. Turns out, I was wrong more times than I can stomach." Ryan tilted his head, his eyes thoughtful. "You're not alone in that. The system's been off the rails for years, but owning up to it, doing something about it's what sets you apart." A faint smile tugged at Jack's lips, fleeting but genuine. "You've got a lot of your dad in you. You know that." Ryan chuckled, a low, warm sound. "I hear that more than you'd think." They lapsed into silence again, the city lights blinking to life one by one as dusk settled in. Then Ryan spoke, his voice soft but steady. "You've changed, Jack. Not everyone can say that." Jack's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the last sliver of sunlight clung to the edge of the world. "It's not enough," he murmured, almost to himself. "I'll never undo what happened to your dad. But I'll keep trying, every damn day, for as long as I've got." Ryan turned to him, his expression softening, a quiet strength in his eyes. "You've done more than you realize. My dad sees it. I see it. That's what counts." For the first time in years, a tentative peace settled over Jack. Not a full redemption, not yet, but a beginning. The sun dipped below the skyline, leaving the 2 men side by side on the bench, their coffee cooling in their hands. Once they'd stood on opposite sides of a fractured system. Jack, the flawed enforcer; Ryan, the son fighting for his father's stolen life. Now they were allies, bound by a shared mission to mend what had been broken. The road ahead was long, shadowed by the lessons of justice and the scars of power misused. But they walked it together, step by determined step, toward something better.